All right, settle in. Or rather, don't get too comfortable. Tonight, we're tearing back the cozy layers of modern life to plunge into the raw, unforgiving reality of medieval winters. We're going deep into the remarkable lives, the sheer stubbornness, and the incredible resilience of medieval peasants. These weren't characters in a storybook. These were the everyday heroes, the unsung champions who, against staggering odds, managed to survive some of the coldest, most brutal nights humanity has ever known. From their ingenious makeshift insulation tricks to their deeply personal, communal sleeping strategies, their existence was a masterclass in grit, ingenuity, and an unshakable will to endure. Before we fully immerse ourselves in their world, a quick moment of modern courtesy. If you're finding value in these journeys into the past, consider hitting that like button and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what we're building here together. It truly helps this little corner of history thrive. Also, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always truly fascinating to connect with our global community. Now, take a moment to dim your lights. Maybe put on a fan for that soft, almost meditative background hum. Let the ambient sounds of your current comfort fade. And let's ease into tonight's journey together, leaving our heated homes and soft blankets behind, even if just for a little while. When the average person thinks of medieval life, their mind often conjures images of jousting knights in shining armor, of opulent grand feasts overflowing with roasted meats, and of boisterous, merry fairs filled with laughter and song. But for the vast majority of the population, the average peasant, winter was a stark, brutal departure from any romanticized notions. It was less about merriment and more about the primal, urgent question, how do we not die tonight? This wasn't just another season on the calendar. It was an annual, relentless test of endurance, a gauntlet thrown down by nature itself, returning with the unwavering predictability of an especially cruel teacher who simply didn't believe in second chances. Picture this, if you dare. You are living, not just existing, but trying to live, in a tiny hut crafted from mud and sticks, its walls so agonizingly thin you could probably hear a mouse whisper from outside, let alone a bird sneeze. There is no insulation to speak of, no glass in your windows. If you're lucky, just a small, flapping hole stuffed with animal skin or a wooden shutter. And you definitely won't be having any thermostat wars with your siblings, because thermostats simply don't exist. The internal temperature of your home? It was usually just a polite, perhaps even sarcastic, couple of degrees above whatever the weather was doing outside. So, if it was freezing outdoors, a biting, bone-chilling 0, it was, congratulations, politely a slightly less freezing 2 degrees inside. A small victory, perhaps, but a victory nonetheless, in a battle you were constantly losing. Nights, of course, were the absolute worst. Darkness wasn't just the absence of light. It was a thick, oppressive blanket that swallowed everything, an entity that pressed in on you, making the air feel heavier, colder. The wind, an unseen tormentor, howled outside like an angry, vengeful ghost, rattling the flimsy structure of your home, searching for every tiny crack and crevice. The fire in the hearth, your only real defense, sputtered pathetically, a brave but ultimately overwhelmed soldier, doing its best to push back the icy onslaught. It might have managed to roast the toes of whoever was sitting closest, offering a fleeting, localized warmth. But if you were on the other side of the small, one-room hovel, a mere few feet away, you might as well have been camping outside, just with slightly worse snacks and no tent. And clothing? It offered little comfort or protection. Peasants didn't own fancy fur coats, plush goose-down blankets, or technologically advanced thermal layers. You had, if you were fortunate, a couple of rough, scratchy tunics spun from coarse wool. Maybe, just maybe, a cloak that smelled suspiciously of goat, carrying the faint, earthy scent of its previous owner. Your grand strategy was simply to layer them, piling them one on top of the other, hoping to transform yourself into some kind of human onion, impenetrable to the cold. Spoiler alert, it didn't really work. The raw wool chafed, the layers restricted movement, and the cold still found its way through. And forget about snuggling under soft quilts, the kind found in modern homes or even in the Lord's manor. Beds were often nothing more than coarse sacks, hastily stuffed with hay or straw, perhaps with a few old, dry rushes thrown in for good measure, to add some bulk and a faint, fleeting scent of the fields. And, as an added bonus, a generous contingent of fleas for extra company, ensuring your nights were never truly restful. Luxury, truly, thy name is medieval peasant life. The cold wasn't merely an uncomfortable sensation. It was an active, ever-present danger, a silent killer lurking in the shadows of every winter night. Frostbite, hypothermia, and the grim reality of simply freezing to death were constant, tangible risks, particularly for the most vulnerable members of the community, young children, whose tiny bodies struggled to retain heat, and the elderly, whose strength had waned. Every single morning that you woke up still breathing, with all your fingers and toes still attached, was considered a minor miracle, a testament to sheer luck and stubborn will. And honestly, it was a miracle worth celebrating, perhaps with a slightly less frozen turnip for breakfast, if you were truly fortunate. So yes, surviving a medieval winter wasn't about comfort, warmth, or even restful sleep. It was about gritting your teeth so hard they ached, piling on every single piece of cloth you owned, huddling so close to your family and livestock that personal space ceased to exist, and praying with every fiber of your being that you didn't wake up with icicles hanging off your eyebrows. And believe it or not, the real adventure, the true depth of their struggle and ingenuity, was just beginning. If you occasionally grumble about your apartment feeling drafty because a window doesn't quite seal properly, medieval peasants would like a solemn word with you. Their homes weren't merely drafty. They were, to put it mildly, enthusiastically designed wind tunnels, albeit with the optimistic addition of a roof. The vast majority of peasant houses were constructed using what historians politely term wattle and daub. In layman's terms, imagine sticks, lots of them, artfully crisscrossed like a giant, rustic basket. Then, picture that basket being lovingly smeared, both inside and out, with a charming, if somewhat odorous, mixture of mud, straw, and, yes, you guessed it, animal dung. They weren't trying to be gross, mind you. Dung was a remarkably effective, cheap, and readily available sticky insulator. Plus, as they say, it was always on hand. These walls, no matter how much care went into their messy construction, didn't stand much of a chance against a proper winter storm. The cold, relentless wind, acting like a malevolent spirit, found every microscopic crack, every inevitable gap, and gleefully danced its way into the single-room homes. It swirled around you, a constant, chilling reminder that you were never truly comfortable, never truly safe from the elements. Privacy? An utterly alien concept. Warmth? A fleeting illusion. Character building? Oh, definitely, in spades. And then there were the roofs. Those picturesque thatched roofs, often seen in romantic illustrations of medieval villages, looked quaint and charming in a summer painting. But after a few months of relentless rain, heavy snow, and the inevitable decay of organic materials, they sagged, they leaked, and they occasionally provided an unexpected entry point for the local wildlife. Nothing quite says, "pleasant evening," like the unexpected thud of a startled squirrel dropping onto your dinner, or the drip of icy water landing squarely on your brow as you try to sleep. Windows, if they existed at all in these humble dwellings, were laughably tiny, mere slits against the vast, dark world outside. They were typically covered with thin, semi-translucent animal hides or rudimentary wooden shutters, offering minimal light and even less protection from the wind. Glass was an exorbitant luxury, so expensive that even the lord of the manor probably couldn't afford more than a single, minuscule pane for his most important room. And peasants? They were simply grateful if the wind didn't rip the cowhide right off the wall in the middle of a screaming blizzard, leaving them completely exposed. To make matters worse, the very ground beneath their feet offered little respite. Floors were typically just compacted dirt, stubbornly clinging to the earth's natural chill. When it rained or snowed heavily, especially during a thaw, mud would insidiously seep up through the ground, transforming the living space. So, technically, one could say they had indoor water features, though they certainly didn't appreciate the squelch and dampness that came with them. In winter, every step inside your own home could feel like trudging across a frozen marsh, the cold rising relentlessly from below, piercing through any thin layer of straw. It was a relentless, three-dimensional assault on your body heat. Cold from below, cold from above, cold from the very air inside the room. But medieval peasants weren't the type to simply whine and succumb. Their lives were a testament to ingenious, often desperate, adaptation. They packed gaps in the walls with whatever they could find: moss, clay, old rags jammed into the worst drafts. They huddled close to each other, creating a living, breathing, human insulation at its finest. Creativity, an indomitable stubbornness, and a bit of sheep grease vigorously rubbed into the walls or onto their bodies were often the only things standing between them and becoming medieval popsicles. Because, in a world where your house was quite literally falling apart and your best protection against the elements involved mud and goat hair, well, at least you could find a grim sort of humor in it. Or try to, anyway, if your teeth weren't chattering too hard to form the words. As if the freezing air wasn't enough of a torment, medieval peasants also had to battle a silent, insidious enemy that rose from below, the frozen ground itself. Floors weren't really floors in the modern sense back then. They were just slightly flatter, compacted patches of earth inside your humble home. Perhaps, if you were exceptionally lucky, someone might have strewn down some straw or old rushes, offering the illusion of a barrier, a deceptive promise of comfort. But make no mistake, you were sleeping one thin, easily crushed layer of vegetation away from the cold, hard, unyielding dirt. And oh, that cold was a relentless, pervasive force. It didn't just radiate. It seeped up from the earth like an evil little ghost, an invisible worm burrowing its way through the meager straw, into your very bones, and straight into your soul, chilling you from the inside out. If you dropped anything onto the floor during a winter night, congratulations. It was now part of the permafrost, awaiting discovery in the spring thaw. Medieval peasants, in their tireless struggle, tried to fight this grim battle in a few resourceful ways. One method, if you could afford the material, or, more realistically, if you could acquire enough of it from your neighbor's field without getting caught, was layering thick mats of straw across the floor. This offered a somewhat decent insulating barrier, a temporary reprieve. However, straw flattened fast under constant use, got moldy even faster in the damp conditions, and added an extra crunchy, rustling soundtrack to your already miserable, flea-infested nights. Some homes opted for dried rushes instead, spreading these long grasses thick upon the dirt. Every so often, they would throw fresh rushes on top, without bothering to clean out the old ones. Over time, this created a fascinating, if unsanitary, ecosystem of decomposing plants, a bustling metropolis for fleas, lice, and whatever other mystery creatures decided to move in and call it home. It was, essentially, medieval carpet padding. If your carpet was alive, slightly damp, and perpetually smelled like a wet dog that had rolled in a barn. Beds, for those who actually possessed them, didn't solve much of the cold from below problem. They were usually little more than crude wooden frames, packed with, you guessed it, more straw or hay. Instead of cozy, supportive mattresses, you had poking, shifting, crunchy layers that did precious little against the relentless cold radiating up from the earth. Tossing and turning in these beds wasn't about finding a comfortable position. It was a desperate, awkward dance to keep blood flowing, to avoid the grim reality of one side of your body freezing solid. The truth is, medieval peasants didn't conquer the icy ground beneath them so much as learn to live uncomfortably, perpetually, just above it. A good night's sleep wasn't about dreams or softness. It was about waking up with all your toes still miraculously attached. And if you could pull that off, hey, you were doing better than most. If medieval homes had a single hero during the long, brutal winter, It certainly wasn't the flimsy roof or the drafty walls, nor even the brave but ultimately inadequate layers of dirt and dung insulation. No, the true champion was the hearth, a crackling, stubborn, sometimes smoky fire pit that served as the absolute only real defense against the soul-crushing cold, the oppressive darkness, and the general, pervasive gloom of medieval life. At the literal and metaphorical center of nearly every peasant home was a simple, rudimentary fire. This was no grand fireplace with a fancy stone mantel, no neatly constructed chimney sweeping the smoke skyward. Instead, you had a basic pit dug into the earth or a rough circle of stones, some half-burned logs, and enough smoke perpetually pouring into the room to make you wonder if you were slowly, inevitably, becoming a cured ham yourself. That's right. Most peasant homes didn't even have chimneys. Smoke just kind of did its best. It drifted out through small, intentionally placed holes in the roof, or seeped through the ever-present cracks in the walls, or, most frequently, drifted right into your lungs if it was feeling lazy and heavy that evening. It was, unequivocally, not ideal for breathing, nor for your long-term overall lifespan. But on the bright side, it did a remarkably effective job of fumigating fleas, lice, and any other unwanted guests that dared to infest your living space. Who needs modern pest control when you're effectively marinating in wood smoke 24/7? The hearth wasn't just about warmth, either, though that was its primary, life-saving function. It was the kitchen, where meager meals were cooked and warmed. It was the primary light source, casting flickering shadows that danced across tired faces. And sometimes, it even served as the medieval version of a communal television. People would gather around the fire, their faces illuminated by its glow, telling stories, gossiping about village happenings, or simply staring into the hypnotic flames because, frankly, there wasn't much else to do after the sun had set and darkness claimed the world outside. Keeping that sacred fire alive wasn't just a nice idea. It was absolutely mandatory, a non-negotiable pact with survival itself. Letting the fire die out overnight was akin to putting up a welcoming sign for the cold, an open invitation for it to creep in and finish you off. Plus, reigniting a fire from scratch in the dead of winter wasn't as simple as striking a match. Matches didn't exist for centuries yet. You had to painstakingly work with flint and steel, praying for a single, precious spark, then coddling that tiny ember with tender love, breath, and whatever dry kindling you hadn't already burned days ago. Everyone in the family had a crucial duty: stoking the flames, diligently watching the embers, carefully adding peat, sticks, or, if you were incredibly lucky, a precious piece of dry wood scavenged or saved. It was a constant, exhausting battle between human persistence and the smothering, relentless cold that wanted nothing more than to snuff out your very existence. The hearth didn't guarantee survival, but without it, survival was downright impossible. It was a smoky, sputtering, often disappointing little fire, messy and inefficient. But in a medieval winter, it was the beating heart of hope, the glowing ember of humanity itself. If there was one thing medieval peasants feared more than running out of ale before the harvest, it was letting the precious fire go out overnight. Without that warm, flickering lifeline, that pulsing heart of the home, the cold would creep in faster than a tax collector after a bountiful harvest, silently, mercilessly. And in the dead of winter, restarting a fire from scratch wasn't just an inconvenience. It could be a deadly, fatal gamble. Matches didn't exist yet. Lighters were a distant, unimaginable dream. Rekindling a fire meant painstakingly striking flint and steel together, praying for a single, miraculous spark to catch, and then coddling that fragile spark with tender love, careful breaths, and whatever dry kindling you hadn't already burned days ago, just to stay warm. Imagine trying to do all this in the freezing, absolute dark, half asleep, your fingers numb and clumsy with cold. Now, add the chilling sound of a hungry wolf howling in the distance for some extra, primal motivation. So, the peasants, masters of practical ingenuity, got smart. They banked the fire. No, not in a cozy medieval savings account. Banking meant carefully burying the glowing embers under a mound of insulating ash right before bed. The ash, acting like a thick, protective blanket, would slowly insulate the coals, keeping them alive, just barely, a faint glow nestled within the gray, until morning. If you did it right, if your technique was precise and practiced, you could stroll over at sunrise, poke the pile a little, add fresh wood, and voila! Fire, reborn without the risk of frostbite and agonizing effort. But if you did it wrong, if the embers died, well, let's just say mornings got a whole lot colder, a whole lot grumpier, and potentially a whole lot more dangerous. Fire banking was an art, a vital piece of knowledge passed down from parent to child, generation after generation, much like a prized family recipe. Everyone had their own little secrets, their nuances. Some swore by using only dry ash. Others insisted a touch of dampness was the key to holding the heat longer. Some packed the embers tightly, suffocating them just enough. Others preferred to let them breathe a little. You could practically start a medieval argument just by suggesting a better fire banking method, a heated debate over technique. It was the ancient version of arguing over barbecue grill temperatures, just with significantly higher survival stakes. Sometimes, even the most expertly banked fire wasn't enough. A particularly howling wind might sneak through an unseen crack in the flimsy wall and snuff it out anyway. Or, in a moment of clumsy chaos, a half-asleep sheep might stumble into the hearth, scattering the precious embers. Yes, it happened. That's why some families took turns, waking in the dead of night to check on the coals, a primal, medieval equivalent of sleepwalking to adjust the thermostat. In the end, fire banking was less about fully mastering nature and more about buying just a few more precious hours of warmth, a fragile lifeline to the dawn. And if you woke up to even a single, stubborn, surviving ember, still pulsing with a faint, orange glow, that was your victory right there. That was enough to face another day of battling the cold. In medieval times, the phrase, "the more the merrier," wasn't just about throwing a better party. It was a crucial, primal winter survival tactic. When the fire sputtered down to its last, gasping embers and the freezing winds whistled through every tiny crack in the wattle and daub walls, there was one absolutely surefire, inexhaustible source of warmth: each other. And if that meant sleeping cheek to cheek with your entire family, a few neighbors who'd come to call, your livestock, and possibly a very confused goose, so be it. Forget about personal space. Privacy wasn't even a recognized concept. On the coldest, most desperate nights, the goal wasn't comfort or restful slumber. It was simply, don't wake up frozen to the floor. Entire households, sometimes multiple families, piled into the warmest, most sheltered corner of the house, often nearest the barely glowing hearth. They wrapped themselves in whatever scraps of cloth, wool, or animal hide they could find, forming what could best be described as a desperate, snoring, breathing human lasagna. Younger children squeezed in between parents, benefiting from the robust warmth. Grandparents snuggled under the outer layers, their frail bodies protected. And if Cousin Ethel showed up unexpectedly, shivering at the door, well, there was always, somehow, room for one more. If you were lucky, truly blessed, you got to sleep in the very middle, where body heat radiated from all sides, a cozy, if crowded, core. If you were unlucky, you were relegated to the edge, the medieval equivalent of sleeping next to the door of a meat locker, exposed to every draft. And woe betide the person who moved too much during the night. You shift once to get comfortable, to ease a crick in your neck, and suddenly you've inadvertently knocked Aunt Mildred into the freezing draft by the wall. Congratulations, you were now the undisputed family villain. Sometimes, even bedding itself was a shared resource, a communal straw mattress, slowly flattening and compacting under the nightly weight of multiple generations. And because hygiene wasn't exactly winning any awards back then, let's just say it wasn't the most fragrant or pristine sleeping arrangement. The air was thick with the scent of unwashed bodies, smoke, and animals. But hey, when it's you versus frostbite, you stop being picky about personal aromas. Body heat wasn't just a nice byproduct. It was a strategic resource, consciously utilized. Some medieval guides even reportedly recommended deliberately arranging the strongest, warmest people on the outside of the group, serving as living, breathing human shields against the penetrating cold. Babies and frail elders, the most vulnerable, were tucked deep into the center, treated like the precious, little heat generators they essentially were. This wasn't just about individual survival, though. Over time, it became an ingrained part of daily life, a fundamental aspect of family and community bonding. Long winter nights, spent huddled together in such intimate proximity, invariably led to storytelling, hushed singing, and undoubtedly some very interesting conversations, muffled under a shared, coarse wool blanket. So, the next time your sibling steals your blanket, or your dog hogs the entire bed, just remember, at least you're not fighting for elbow space between a snoring uncle and a particularly judgmental goat. If you thought dealing with modern roommates could be a challenge, medieval peasants would like to politely introduce you to their winter housemates: cows, goats, pigs, chickens, basically anything with a pulse and a little bit of body heat. Bringing animals indoors wasn't just a quirky village tradition or a sentimental gesture. It was a profoundly vital strategy for sheer survival. Livestock generated precious warmth, and in a poorly insulated hovel where the wind howled louder than your rumbling stomach, every single degree mattered. Plus, there was a pragmatic bonus. If your goat shared a wall with you, it was slightly less likely to get stolen by a desperate neighbor in the dead of night. Two birds, one stinky stone. At night, the house transformed into a chaotic, living furnace. Chickens nested in corners, finding perches on anything available. Pigs snorted contentedly near the hearth, oblivious to personal boundaries. And the cows, the biggest and warmest of the bunch, would lounge luxuriously against the wattle and daub walls, chewing cud with serene indifference, as if they paid rent and were entitled to the best spots. It wasn't glamorous. Far from it. If you've ever been stuck in a car on a summer road trip with someone who forgot to shower, now imagine that. But it's a cow. It's winter. And there's literally nowhere else to go. The smells? Oh, they were legendary. By springtime, the accumulated perfume of a shared winter with livestock was something fierce, an olfactory tapestry woven from manure, smoke, damp straw, and unwashed bodies. You didn't need to light a candle to mask anything. Your nostrils were already on a wild, involuntary ride. But medieval peasants developed what one might call a selective nose. They didn't complain much, not outwardly, because they knew one uncomfortable but undeniable truth. The more animals inside, the fewer frozen toes, or worse, in the morning for the humans. Certain animals even had prime spots within the communal sleeping arrangement. Cows, being the biggest and most substantial sources of warmth, usually took center stage, often nearest the family's sleeping area. Goats were allowed closer in for their body heat, and frankly, because goats, being goats, would likely find a way inside anyway, regardless of human permission. Chickens often roost in rafters or old baskets, safe from ground-level predators and contributing their meager warmth. And pigs, well, pigs didn't much care for human hierarchy. They simply plopped down wherever they pleased, probably right in the middle of the floor, creating an obstacle course for anyone needing to move in the dark. Of course, sharing your bedroom with livestock wasn't without its hazards or indignities. Imagine drifting off peacefully, only to be rudely awakened by a chicken deciding your hair made an excellent, soft perch, or stepping barefoot into something suspicious first thing in the morning. Yes, medieval mornings could be full of surprises. Still, despite the constant noise, the pervasive smells, and the occasional unexpected hoof to the ribs, peasants understood the simple, brutal math of survival. Cold kills, and cows, with their substantial body heat, cuddle whether they want to or not. In the desperate, daily battle against winter's icy fingers, a warm, slightly slobbery cow breath was often the deciding factor between another day of life and an early, frozen death. In medieval winters, fashion wasn't about looking good or keeping up with the latest trends. It was about one brutally simple, non-negotiable imperative, not dying. Peasants certainly weren't flipping through catalogs of haute couture. They were layering up with a grim, determined intensity, preparing for battle against the grim reaper himself, who often took the form of hypothermia. The rule was uncomplicated and absolute. If you owned it, you wore it. Sometimes, often, all at once. First, the basic undertunic, a coarse, scratchy, and probably not too clean linen shirt, acted as a foundational layer. Over that, a thicker woolen tunic was added. Then another, if you were lucky enough to possess one. Add some leggings that sagged at the knees, offering minimal warmth to the lower extremities. A rough, heavy cloak would be draped over your shoulders, and if you were truly, miraculously fortunate, a patched-up sheepskin, still smelling faintly of the animal, would be thrown on top like a prized, albeit smelly, trophy. Congratulations! You were now approximately 10% warmer and a guaranteed 90% itchier, encased in a mobile, multi-layered prison of wool and dirt. Footwear was another luxury. Proper, sturdy boots were rare. Many peasants wrapped their feet in layers of cloth or old rags, stuffing these improvised foot coverings into rudimentary wooden clogs. If the relentless cold still managed to bite through these meager defenses, well, you just added another rag, enduring the discomfort, and hoped desperately that you wouldn't lose a toe to frostbite. And forget about washing all these vital layers. Washing your clothes in the dead of winter meant dragging them to a frozen stream, laboriously smashing through the thick ice, and then facing the agonizing wait of 2 days for your only set of clothes to dry. That's if they didn't simply freeze solid into a tragic, unwearable shirt cycle in the sub-zero temperatures. Most peasants wisely and pragmatically decided that smelling like a potent mix of smoke, sweat, and sheep was a small, acceptable price to pay for the invaluable benefit of not freezing solid. Interestingly, this very dirt and grease buildup on their clothing actually had a bonus feature. It acted as an additional layer of insulation. That grimy, often crusty, layer of accumulated filth and natural body oils locked in body heat, creating an unexpected thermal barrier. It was like a medieval Gore-Tex jacket, only infinitely smellier and far less socially acceptable by today's standards. Hats, scarves, and gloves were treasured possessions, often homemade from whatever scraps of wool or leather people could scrounge. A simple woolen cap, pulled low over the ears, could mean the literal difference between making it through the night or waking up with your hair frozen solidly to the wall of your hut. Gloves were often crude, misshapen affairs, sometimes looking more like sad puppet costumes than anything fashionable, but they were vital. Children, especially, were swaddled until they resembled adorable, albeit awkwardly waddling, overstuffed turnips. The primary, overriding goal was to trap as much precious body heat as humanly possible, regardless of aesthetics. Style, elegance, they were unheard of concepts. Warmth was the real medieval flex, the ultimate badge of survival. So, the next time you grumble about having to layer up for a chilly day, just remember, medieval peasants walked around wearing half their entire wardrobe at once, looking like lumpy, walking laundry bags, and they counted themselves incredibly lucky for it. In the medieval peasant playbook, dirt wasn't just something you grudgingly scrubbed off after a long day's toil. It was practically a survival tool, a strategic ally in the relentless battle against winter's chill. As it turns out, getting grimy wasn't a sign you'd given up on life or cleanliness. It was tactical, strategic, dare we say, genius. See, winter posed a very specific, existential problem: heat loss. Clean clothes, especially freshly laundered linen, were surprisingly terrible at keeping you warm. They were breathable, yes, but when the air temperature hovered somewhere between hypothermia and instant regret, breathable wasn't exactly a selling point. That's where dirt, in all its glorious, unhygienic splendor, came in. As peasants trudged through day after day, week after week, without the luxury or possibility of washing their clothing, layers of grime, natural body oils, and good old-fashioned mud began to build up, forming a protective crust on their tunics, cloaks, and leggings. Over time, this natural armor effectively clogged the tiny, breathable gaps in the fabric, making their clothes remarkably more wind-resistant and insulating. It was like medieval weatherproofing, a biological barrier against the elements, just infinitely smellier. Sure, you might have smelled like a goat who lost a particularly pungent bet, but guess what? You were warm. And in the cold, warmth trumped every other consideration. In fact, some medieval folk believed that washing yourself too often in winter could actually make you sick, exposing your vulnerable skin to the harsh cold and stripping away natural defenses. It was far better, in their estimation, to keep that protective, almost holy, filth barrier intact. Bathing was a rare, monumental event, typically reserved for specific times of year or necessity. Laundry was even rarer, and soap, when it existed at all in its crude forms, was reserved for serious occasions, perhaps when the bishop was showing up, or, more grimly, right before you died. Adding to the strategic genius, peasants simply layered their new clothes on top of the old, without removing the ones underneath. You didn't just replace last month's tunic. You threw this month's tunic on top of it. Eventually, you became a walking, breathing museum of the past 6 weeks, every stain and patch telling the heroic story of that one time you slipped in the mud but didn't actually die. To any outside observer, a medieval peasant might have looked and certainly smelled like they had completely given up on any semblance of hygiene. But the peasants knew better. That grimy, crusty, multi-layered tunic was their thermal shield, their first line of defense against death by frostbite. It wasn't glamorous, not by a long shot, but then again, neither was freezing to death because you wanted to smell like a field of wildflowers. Besides, in a world where literally everyone stank to high heaven, you weren't offending anyone. Nose blindness, born of necessity, was practically a way of life. So yes, in medieval winters, filth wasn't failure. It was fashion. It was function. It was a badge of honor. And if you had a thick, greasy, thoroughly encrusted outer layer by February, you, my friend, were undoubtedly winning at life. If you thought medieval peasants spent their winters tucked into plush feather beds with intricately embroidered quilts, think again. The reality was a bit more rustic, a good deal more itchy, and infinitely less comfortable. And by rustic, I mean something along the lines of, let's sleep on a pile of dead plants and fervently hope for the best. Beds in the medieval peasant world were usually, if you were fortunate enough to afford such a luxury, a rough, crudely constructed wooden frame. This frame was then covered with a large sack, generously stuffed full of straw, hay, or old rushes. That's it. No memory foam, no orthopedic support, no five-star hotel experience. Just a crunchy, lumpy, slightly pokey mess that smelled faintly of barnyard animals and, quite often, regret. Every toss and turn in the night, a desperate attempt to find a less uncomfortable position or generate a bit of warmth, brought with it a delightful, rustling soundtrack of crinkling straw and the occasional sharp jab from a rogue, unyielding stalk. Some peasants, lacking even the means for a simple wooden frame, skipped that luxury altogether. They simply threw their pile of straw or rushes straight onto the dirt floor, creating what could only be described as a luxurious, ground-level sleeping experience that modern influencers, in their quest for authenticity, would probably rebrand as earth-connected slumber or biointegrated rest. These straw mattresses weren't just uncomfortable. They were inherently temporary, a constantly degrading form of bedding. Over time, the straw would flatten, lose its loft and insulating properties, grow damp and moldy in the humid confines of the hut, and inevitably attract an ever-growing population of bugs, fleas, and other unwelcome critters. Eventually, your bed would generally turn into a biological hazard zone, a thriving ecosystem of decomposition and infestation. Changing the straw was a big, arduous event, typically done only a few times a year if you were diligent, or, more realistically, whenever your bed started actively moving without your permission. Rushes, those long, hardy grasses, were a popular alternative or addition. These were spread thick on the floor, sometimes mixed with aromatic herbs like lavender or rosemary, an attempt to mask the overwhelming, pervasive odor of livestock, smoke, and daily life. Fresh rushes did indeed smell lovely for about a day or two, offering a fleeting illusion of freshness. After that, however, they quickly became part of the muddy, trampled, organic landscape inside the house, blending seamlessly with the compacted dirt, spilled food scraps, and whatever else wandered in from outside. And let's not forget the multitude of bedfellows. Fleas, lice, and other charming critters loved straw bedding almost as much as the peasants did. This wasn't merely a minor inconvenience. It was a nightly, microscopic war waged on every inch of skin. The straw, warm and damp from body heat, became a five-star resort for parasites, a bustling metropolis of biting, crawling residents. If you woke up scratching more than you slept, a constant, maddening itch clawing at your skin from head to toe, congratulations. You weren't just sleeping. You were living the authentic medieval experience, a constant reminder that your bed was less a sanctuary and more a battlefield. Despite the relentless itch and the ever-present company of unwelcome guests, these humble beds were lifesavers, literally. Piles of straw, often several feet deep, provided a crucial insulating layer against the frozen earth, a barrier between a peasant's shivering body and the bitter cold seeping up from the ground. And when families, or even entire households, clumped together atop them, they created pockets of shared body heat, a communal furnace in miniature. This was medieval central heating at its finest, raw, inefficient, but undeniably effective. So next time you sink into your soft, supportive mattress, probably hypoallergenic and free of biting insects, just remember somewhere out there a medieval peasant is looking down at you from history, a ghost of the past, grinning through a mouthful of missing teeth and likely muttering, "Must be nice. Must be truly, wonderfully nice." When you live in a house made of sticks, mud, and an almost pathological amount of optimism, you quickly learn that winter breezes aren't just a nuisance. They are personal attacks. Each gust feels like a directed assault, a betrayal from the very air itself. Medieval peasants didn't just fight the cold from the outside, battling blizzards and frostbite. They fought it from inside their own homes, a constant, desperate internal struggle armed with nothing but whatever they could cram into the ceaseless network of cracks. And trust me, there were a lot of cracks. Their houses were living, breathing entities, constantly shifting, settling, and crumbling around them. Walls warped with damp, mud crumbled in dusty flakes, and the thatched roof, a mere sieve against the elements, sagged under the weight of snow and time. The cold seemed to possess an almost sentient malice, finding new, insidious places to sneak in every night, like a mischievous poltergeist with a deeply personal grudge. Sealing up the house became an intricate art form, a constant winter ritual. Peasants meticulously stuffed gaps with anything remotely soft, squishy, or vaguely insulating. Handfuls of moss, wads of old straw, scraps of threadbare cloth, bundles of dry grass, and sometimes even matted animal hair. If it could block a draft, it was jammed into a hole somewhere with fervent hope. Some particularly determined, or perhaps utterly desperate, souls daubed extra layers of mud and dung over the outside of their walls as an annual winter project. Imagine standing there in freezing weather, breath pluming in front of you, hands numb, slapping cold manure onto your own house while muttering to yourself, "This is fine. This is luxury." Because, in a perverse way, it was. Each layer, however foul-smelling, was another precious barrier against the relentless chill. Roof leaks were another perpetual battlefield, a dripping, freezing enemy within. Thatch, while cheap and plentiful, wasn't exactly waterproof, especially after a few seasons of rain, snow, and the inevitable decomposition. A peasant's sleep could be abruptly shattered by a sudden icy drip onto their face. They would plug holes in the roof with spare bits of cloth, bundles of reeds collected from a nearby marsh, or in moments of true, desperate ingenuity, chunks of turf stolen from the nearest field. Over time, Every home eventually started to look like a slightly sad, perpetually damp patchwork quilt, stitched together by someone who had given up halfway through the design. Doors and windows? If you had them, you were lucky. But even then, they were often little more than crude wood planks hung by rusty iron nails and sheer, unyielding stubbornness. Window holes were rarely glazed. Instead, they were often covered with animal hides or thick cloth soaked in animal fat. This blocked out the worst drafts, diffused the light into a perpetual twilight, and added a bonus aroma of mystery meat and rendered grease to the living space. Every night was a pitched battle between human ingenuity and the relentless, sneaky cold. One minute you might be blessed with a fleeting sensation of warmth. The next a sudden gust would find the one spot you missed, slamming into the room and slapping you awake like a frosty hand of doom. Yet somehow, through sheer cleverness, bull-headed stubbornness, and a stubborn refusal to accept slightly frozen as a permanent state of being, medieval peasants patched, stuffed, and muddled their way through the worst winters nature could throw at them, one muddy handful at a time. When the cold bites hard enough to keep you awake at night, medieval peasants had a radical solution. Forget about everyone getting a full night's sleep simultaneously. Instead, they developed a survival strategy that today would make any military commander proud: sleeping in shifts. This wasn't some grand, organized system complete with whistles and roll calls. It was far simpler, far more desperate, and born of grim necessity. Roughly half the household stayed awake, tending to the fire, patching up stray drafts, and generally keeping a vigilant eye against the encroaching cold. Meanwhile, the other half curled up under threadbare blankets and a deep pile of hay, trying to catch a few precious hours of half-frozen, restless sleep. The fire, the beating heart of the home, needed constant attention. Left alone, it would die down into a sullen heap of ash, and restarting it, remember, was about as easy as getting a stubborn donkey to dance a jig in a blizzard. So, someone always had to be on ember patrol, poking and coaxing the precious heat. And since absolutely no one wanted to get up once they were finally warmish, families rotated shifts. You dozed for a few hours, got elbowed awake by the next unfortunate soul, then stumbled over to the hearth to poke, prod, and curse the fire back to life, while trying not to step on a goat or a sleeping sibling. The rotation wasn't glamorous. There were no night vision goggles to navigate the gloom, no late-night snacks for energy, and certainly no 5 more minutes snooze buttons. Just stiff joints, heavy eyelids gritty with smoke, and a growing resentment toward whoever snored loudest during your shift. Children old enough to hold a stick and stay awake were pressed into service, learning early on that in winter, everyone pulled their weight or froze trying. Grandparents sometimes stayed by the fire for longer stretches, both because of their accumulated experience in fire tending and, frankly, because arthritis made lying down and getting up again a truly monumental event. And when it was finally your turn to sleep, good luck. You had people moving about, animals rustling and snuffling in the gloom, wind battering the flimsy walls, and the occasional sharp nudge from a sibling who accidentally rolled over too hard. Getting quality, uninterrupted rest was a genuine miracle. Yet, despite the exhaustion, the system worked. Sleeping in shifts meant that there was always a set of eyes and cold, begrudging hands ready to keep the hearth alive. The embers survived, and by extension, so did the family. So next time you grumble about waking up to adjust the thermostat or let the cat out, spare a thought for the medieval peasant squinting into a smoking fire at 3 a.m., wondering if toes were really that important. After all, you know it's truly cold when you have to consciously think about how you breathe just to stay alive. Medieval peasants didn't just battle the freezing air with cloaks, roaring, or often smoldering fires and creative sleeping arrangements. They even adjusted the way they inhaled and exhaled to survive the night. The problem was simple and terrifying. Deep, open-mouthed breathing pulled icy air straight into your lungs, chilling your core from the inside out. In a world where pneumonia could kill you faster than you could say Hail Mary, that was a risk nobody, not even the most stoic peasant, wanted to take. So, peasants learned the art of what you might call survival breathing. Instead of sucking in huge, gasping gulps of air like they'd just run a marathon across a frozen field, they kept their breathing shallow, slow, and most importantly, through the nose. The idea was to gently warm the incoming air a bit as it passed through the nasal passages, taking the sting out of the Arctic blast before it hit their delicate lungs. It wasn't perfect, but it was infinitely better than coughing yourself into an early grave by February. If you accidentally took a big, thoughtless mouthful of cold air, congratulations. You just bought yourself a ticket to a week of hacking up bits of what felt like your soul, with no doctors in sight, and only grandma to treat you with hot onion tea and firm, insistent prayers. Some people even tucked parts of their cloaks, shawls, or rags up over their faces while they slept, creating a makeshift breath-warmer barrier. Of course, this also meant you ended up with a damp, slightly soggy fabric patch clinging to your mouth by morning, smelling faintly of your own stale breath and whatever else clung to the cloth. But hey, it beat freezing from the inside out. Children were taught these tricks early on, often with stern admonishments. Parents would scold little ones for panting like dogs indoors during the cold months, teaching them the vital, if uncomfortable, art of nasal breathing. And honestly, between strict breathing lessons, itchy wool layers, and sleeping next to an aggressively gassy goat, medieval childhood winters were character-building on a whole different level. At night, tucked into straw bedding under piles of scratchy cloaks and next to a gently steaming cow, breathing became an art form. Slow, steady, nose only, and as minimal as humanly possible, like some grim medieval version of a yoga retreat, only with more frostbite and fewer inspirational quotes. In the grand survival playbook, it wasn't the flashiest strategy, but it worked. One shallow breath at a time, peasants endured another night in the long, relentless war against winter. In the endless battle against medieval winter, peasants discovered an unlikely secret weapon, a full stomach. Turns out, one of the best ways to fight off the relentless cold wasn't another scratchy wool cloak or a bigger fire. It was stuffing yourself with something hearty and heavy right before bed. Calories meant warmth, quite literally. The more your body had to digest, the more it heated itself up doing the work. It was basic medieval thermodynamics. Eat a heavy meal, generate internal heat, and maybe, just maybe, survive until morning without turning into a peasant-shaped popsicle. So, what did medieval peasants pile onto their plates before a long, freezing night? Think thick, unctuous stews, heavy with humble but calorie-dense root vegetables like turnips, onions, and parsnips. Grains were lifesavers, too. Oat porridge, thick barley gruel, or dense, chewy rye bread. These weren't culinary delights. They were fuel. If you were especially lucky, say after a festival day or a generous slaughter, you might even get a hunk of salted pork or a slice of dried sausage thrown into the pot, a rare and cherished treat. This wasn't comfort food in the Instagram sense, with delicate presentation or artisanal garnishes. It was one enormous, often vaguely brown meal designed to sit in your gut like a friendly brick, slowly burning through the night and keeping you just a little bit warmer. It wasn't just about eating a lot. It was about eating smart. Foods that took longer to digest provided a slow, steady trickle of warmth, sustaining the internal furnace for hours. Fatty foods were particularly praised, not just for the energy they provided, but because fat burns slower than lean meat, offering prolonged warmth. A belly full of stew, dense bread, and a questionable amount of rendered lard? That was peak medieval winter luxury. Parents made sure even the pickiest children ate heartily, often with little ceremony or negotiation. Nobody cared if little Thomas didn't like turnips. You ate the turnips, every last one, or you shivered through the night thinking about how much you suddenly missed those despised vegetables. Harsh but brutally effective parenting, medieval style. Of course, heavy nighttime eating came with its own hazards. You might be warmer, but you were also risking a night of vivid, bizarre dreams fueled by a stomach trying desperately to process an entire field's worth of cabbages. Was it worth it? Absolutely. Because in the end, peasants weren't aiming for a Michelin star meal, they were aiming to survive. And if that meant going to bed full, bloated, breathing gently through your nose next to a gently steaming cow while experiencing Technicolor nightmares. Well, that was just another night in the ongoing quest to see another frosty sunrise. Long before electric blankets and fancy heated mattress pads, medieval peasants had to get creative if they wanted a little extra warmth at bedtime. And that's how the humble hay box and the ever-glamorous heated stone became winter's unsung heroes. Let's start with the hay box. It sounds rustic, and it absolutely was, but the underlying idea was pure genius in its simplicity. Peasants would take a sturdy wooden box, line it thickly with hay, and use it to store food that had been cooked earlier, keeping it warm for hours. Leftover stew, hot porridge, even roasted root vegetables. Toss it into the hay box, cover it up tightly, and it stayed hot enough for a late-night snack without needing to risk reigniting the precious fire. Medieval slow cookers, basically. But peasants didn't just stop at food. They realized that if hay could trap the heat from a stew pot, it could also trap the heat from something even better, something more solid and reliable: rocks. Enter the era of the heated stone. Before heading to bed, someone, probably whichever unlucky child lost the family argument, or the spouse with the steadiest hands, would grab a flat, smooth stone and carefully chuck it into the heart of the hearth fire. After roasting it until it was nearly too hot to touch, a fine line between helpful and a third-degree burn, they'd fish it out using a stick or some crude tongs. The stone, still radiating a blissful, deep warmth, would then be carefully wrapped in layers of rags, tucked into an old piece of cloth, or sometimes jammed into a clay pot. Then, it was slipped under the hay in the mattress, nestled against the small of the back, or placed down at the foot of the bed. A medieval heating pad, ready to do battle against the frozen earth. Of course, there were risks. If you didn't wrap the stone properly, congratulations. You now had a small, localized house fire, a tiny inferno bubbling up from beneath your bedding. And if you dropped it on your foot, well, let's just say winter injuries weren't always caused by slipping on ice. But when everything went right, that carefully heated stone provided precious, comforting warmth that could last for hours, a glowing ember of heat against the encroaching cold. It wasn't luxurious by any stretch, but when you lived in a half-frozen hut, luxury was defined as not waking up with icicles dangling from your nose. In the grand arsenal of medieval winter survival, a hot rock tucked into some hay might not sound glamorous, but for peasants clinging to whatever heat they could find, it was a tiny, vital miracle. In a medieval peasant's home, the hearth wasn't just where you cooked dinner. It was practically a family member. A temperamental, smoky, sometimes uncooperative family member, sure, but still absolutely essential to survival, especially when it came time to sleep. The closer you were to the fire, the better your odds of waking up unfrozen. That meant sleeping arrangements were less about personal preference and more about strategic positioning, a grim chess game against hypothermia. Infants, the elderly, and anyone sick or frail got first dibs on prime real estate nearest the precious warmth. Parents, older kids, and sturdier adults fanned out from there, forming human insulation layers, their bodies a living shield against the icy walls. Being assigned a spot close to the fire wasn't just kindness, it was basic survival math. Babies were fragile heat generators, susceptible to the slightest chill, and elders were precious repositories of family knowledge. And, let's be honest, the best gossip. Protecting them with prime warmth was non-negotiable. But it wasn't all cozy toasting by the flames. Too close, and you risked waking up with your hair singed, your cloak smoldering suspiciously, or even a painful burn. Too far, and you were basically camping in an ice box, watching your breath cloud in the frigid air. It was a delicate dance. Stay near enough to bask in the fire's glow, but not so near that you had to explain to your neighbor why you now looked like a half-cooked roast. The fire also didn't spread warmth evenly. It mostly roasted the people directly in front of it, while everyone else fought over the narrow cone of heat, like cold lizards jostling for a sunbeam. If you were lucky enough to fall asleep facing the fire, you might have one blissfully warm side, and one side frozen so solid you could probably knock on it. Pets and livestock, of course, muscled in two, seeking warmth with single-minded determination. A dog might wedge itself between you and the fire, its tail wagging dangerously close to the open flame. Chickens sometimes perched precariously on hearthstones, plucking softly into the night like tiny feathery guardians of warmth. Every crackle of the logs, every shift of glowing embers, was a tiny promise. You're still alive. You're still warm for now. And so peasants drifted into uneasy sleep, lulled by the fire's pops and hisses, each breath forming small clouds in the frigid air just beyond the fire's fragile circle of heat. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't comfortable, but it was life, clinging to warmth by a thread of glowing coals. In the medieval world, no one survived winter alone, unless they wanted to become a very stylish frozen statue by January. Survival wasn't just a family affair. It was a village project, a messy, muddy, loud collaboration where everyone's warmth and life depended on everyone else. The peasants knew instinctively that in the dead of winter, a strong fire and a pile of hay could only do so much. If your neighbor's house went dark, you noticed. If the smoke from old Tom's hearth suddenly stopped curling into the sky, someone went to check. And not just because Tom owed you a chicken, though that might certainly be part of it, but because community meant survival. Villages had unofficial winter watchers, often the young or the elderly who couldn't work the fields, but who could keep a vigilant eye on who was coughing too hard, who hadn't come to barter at the market in a few days, or whose home looked a little too still in the morning frost. These people were the medieval version of neighborhood patrol, minus the reflective vests, plus a lot more sheep. If a family's fire went out, it was a near emergency, a silent siren of disaster. A good neighbor would rush over with a glowing coal bundled in rags, or better yet, invite them into their own smoky, overcrowded hut for the night. Yes, it meant squeezing an extra 4 bodies into an already cramped space, amplifying the smells and the cacophony, but it was infinitely better than finding frozen friends come the spring thaw. Communal food stores played a role too. During especially brutal winters, villages sometimes pooled their last salted meat, their dwindling sacks of grain, and their dried vegetables. It was grim charity, a shared sacrifice. No one had much, but a few communal meals, stretched thin and eaten together, could be the difference between staggering into spring or not. Even children understood the stakes. They helped deliver wood, shared embers, and ran urgent messages when someone needed help. No one was too small or too tired when winter came knocking. Sure, medieval villages weren't all sunshine and hugs. Feuds happened. Disputes over land, stray goats, or who borrowed whose good cooking pot never really went away. But when the nights grew deadly cold, old grudges were often quietly shelved, deemed an unaffordable luxury. After all, a rival was still a human being, still worth saving, because tomorrow it might be you needing rescue. In the icy heart of winter, the village became one big, stubborn family, sometimes dysfunctional, often hilarious in its shared misery, but always fiercely determined to survive together, one muddy boot, one crackling ember, one frozen smile at a time. When medieval peasants faced the merciless cold of winter, they didn't just pile on cloaks or stoke the fire. They prayed a lot. Because when the wind howled like wolves outside your paper-thin walls and the fire shrank into sullen embers, you wanted every possible advantage, including a little divine intervention. Faith wasn't just a Sunday affair back then. It was woven into every frozen breath, every shivering muscle. Before crawling under layers of straw and scratchy wool, families would kneel together, offering up hurried, heartfelt prayers to keep the fire burning, the roof intact, and their toes still attached by morning. Saints became more than distant holy figures. They were winter's frontline defense, called upon for very specific, practical needs. Saint Aimé, for instance, was called upon to protect against throat ailments, not a minor concern when one careless mouthful of icy air could land you coughing up your soul. Saint Nicholas wasn't just the jolly gift-giver of later legend. He was also fervently asked to protect households from sudden ruin during the lean, deadly months. Superstitions wrapped themselves snugly around daily survival like an extra blanket. Some families sprinkled a little holy water near the hearth before sleeping, hoping it would protect against evil spirits or, at the very least, mischievous drafts. Others marked doorways with blessed chalk after certain feast days, pleading for warmth and luck to find their way inside. Candles played a role too. Special vigil candles, often blessed by the local priest or the most pious old woman in the village, were sometimes kept burning throughout the night, a flickering, defiant plea against the cold darkness clawing at the walls. And of course, no serious winter prayer session was complete without a few promises. Dear Lord, if you just get us through this night, I swear I'll be kinder to my neighbor, even the one who keeps stealing our turnips. Just one more night, and I'll mend the hole in the thatch that I've been putting off. Faith wasn't some abstract comfort. It was a daily, urgent conversation, a raw plea for tangible help. The peasants weren't asking for luxury, just survival. A little heat, a little food, and one more day to muddle through until spring finally broke the frozen grip on their tiny villages. It was simple, raw hope, whispered into the smoky rafters, tangled in breathless prayers, and tucked under itchy blankets that somehow carried them through the endless, merciless nights of winter. For all the ingenuity, the fervent prayers, and the sheer, unyielding stubbornness medieval peasants threw at winter, the truth was often chilling. Sometimes, it just wasn't enough. And when winter won, it didn't just take a few unlucky souls. It took entire families, whole villages, vanishing them into silence beneath a heavy shroud of snow and ice. Some winters were particularly cruel, like the infamous Great Famine Winter of 1315, when relentless rains destroyed crops, livestock starved in their frozen pastures, and freezing temperatures turned an already brutal existence into a slow, grinding disaster that stretched for years. People were so desperate that stories whispered of eating shoe leather, tree bark, and in the most horrifying cases, each other. Failure to keep the fire alive wasn't just an inconvenience. It was often a death sentence. Without the hearth's meager warmth, families huddled together for the final time, pressing against each other in a futile attempt to share vanishing body heat. Neighbors would sometimes stumble across whole households in spring, bodies still locked in one another's frozen embrace, as if trying to share just a little more heat until the very end. Houses themselves could collapse under the crushing weight of heavy snow or the battering force of ice storms. A roof giving way in the middle of a frozen night wasn't just catastrophic. It was often fatal, burying sleeping families under icy debris. Dragging yourself through thigh-deep snow to beg shelter from neighbors wasn't a guarantee either, especially if those neighbors were already stretched to the breaking point, their own resources dwindling. Disease loved the cold, too, thriving in the weakened bodies and cramped, smoky homes. Starvation weakened the immune system, and crowded living conditions turned the huts into breeding grounds for pneumonia, bronchitis, and other deadly infections. A simple cough in December could easily be a funeral by January. And then there was the quiet horror, frostbite. Fingers, toes, even ears blackened and died while still attached to their owners, a creeping rot that stole pieces of them. Some villagers survived winters, but at the cost of their limbs, a grim badge of honor that silently proclaimed, "I made it through, but winter took a piece of me." Yet, what's most haunting isn't just the sheer scale of death, it's the eerie normalcy of it. People accepted that each winter, some among them wouldn't see the spring thaw. Death wasn't unexpected. It was just another neighbor at the door, wrapped in frost, waiting its turn. Even amid the bitter cold and constant threat, medieval peasants pressed on, stubborn, grieving, clinging to life. Because as long as there was one ember left in the hearth, one breath hanging in the frozen air, there was still a fight worth fighting. When we look back at medieval peasants, those muddy, frost-bitten survivors of endless winters, it's tempting to see only their hardships, the cracked hands, the frozen toes, the smoke-choked huts, the constant struggle against elements beyond their control. But buried beneath all that struggle is something far more powerful, something that echoes through history. a legacy of raw, stubborn ingenuity and unbreakable endurance. They didn't have central heating or thermal jackets, or even the cozy luxury of a memory foam mattress. They didn't even have the luxury of assuming they'd survive until spring. But what they did have, and what they left behind, was the definitive blueprint for resilience. Every hay-stuffed mattress, every hand-banked fire, every moss-crammed wall gap was a testament to human creativity under immense pressure. Faced with impossible odds, they didn't collapse in despair. They adapted. They learned from the land, from each other, and from the bitter, unforgiving lessons carved by each brutal winter. Their communities were built on more than shared land. They were built on shared survival, a collective understanding that they were all in it together. They taught each other to watch over the sick, to pull resources when food ran low, to trust that helping a freezing neighbor today meant someone might help you tomorrow. They lived by the understanding that no one beats winter alone. Their faith, too, was a kind of endurance, a deep-seated wellspring of hope. They wove prayers into their daily lives, not just out of fear, but out of a fragile, stubborn hope that tomorrow might be a little warmer, a little brighter. Hope that after 100 dark nights, spring would come again, and life, indomitable and persistent, would find a way to push through the frozen ground. And somehow, against all odds, it did. Because of their sacrifices, because of their unglamorous victories, merely surviving one more night, weathering one more brutal storm, future generations were not only able to endure, but to thrive. Bit by frozen bit, with each crude tool fashioned, each patch of barren soil coaxed into yielding, they pushed humanity forward. They navigated winters their ancestors could barely survive, transforming a world of stark necessity until warmth and comfort became common expectations rather than distant, desperate dreams. Their blood, their sweat, their unyielding ingenuity are stitched invisibly into the very fabric of the lives we inhabit today. Every soft, cozy blanket wrapped around us, every warm, well-insulated house we call home, every lazy winter evening spent sipping tea under the gentle glow of soft lights. All of it is the indelible end result of countless medieval peasants who, against impossible odds, simply refused to give in to the cold. So the next time the wind howls a mournful dirge outside your double-paned window, perhaps spare a moment to remember them. The nameless, often forgotten, yet profoundly fearless ones who forged shivering survival into a living legacy, one precious ember, one defiant breath, one stubborn heartbeat at a time. And Bullen didn't enter the world with a crown nestled upon her head or vast armies pledged at her feet. Born around 1501, most likely amidst the grandeur of Blickling Hall or the ancient stones of Hever Castle, she was the daughter of Thomas Bullen, an ambitiously rising diplomat, and Elizabeth Howard, a noblewoman whose veins pulsed with the powerful blood of one of England's most influential families. In the intricate, rigid tapestry of Tudor society, Anne's birth barely stirred a ripple, a minor detail in a world obsessed with lineage and male succession. Yet, from these seemingly modest beginnings, something truly extraordinary was quietly taking root. A life was unfolding that would one day not just nudge, but violently tilt the entire course of English history. From an early age, Anne was set apart, not by inherited wealth or titles, but by the undeniable brilliance of her mind. She possessed a quick wit, a spirited independence, and an undeniable magnetism that captivated all who encountered her. Recognizing this rare and potent potential, her shrewd family made a pivotal decision. They sent her abroad to the continent, a world far more sophisticated and intellectually vibrant than England. There, amidst the dazzling courts of Europe, Anne's true education began, far beyond the typical domestic tutelage of English gentlewomen. Her journey began at the glittering court of Margaret of Austria in the Netherlands, a privileged experience few English girls could ever dream of. In that crucible of refinement, Anne absorbed the intricate art of diplomacy, the nuanced elegance of courtly manners, and the subtle, dangerous dance of European politics. But it was in France that Anne's brilliance was truly polished. sharpened into a formidable weapon. She spent formative years immersed in the sophisticated atmospheres of Queen Claude and, later, the intellectually vibrant court of Queen Marguerite of Navarre, not merely learning a language, but mastering the intricate lexicon of influence, the effortless grace of true elegance, the delicate art of flirtation, and the devastating power of wit. While other young women of her station diligently perfected their embroidery, and, with an insatiable hunger for knowledge, mastered the art of compelling conversation, the delicate craft of courtly intrigue, and the invaluable skill of commanding attention without ever appearing to seek it. By the time she returned to England in the early 1520s, Anne Boleyn was a phenomenon, something truly rare and utterly captivating. She was a woman who could effortlessly rival the sophistication and intellectual prowess of continental courtiers, yet she carried within her the fierce, unyielding ambition of a rapidly rising English house. She was not, by conventional standards, a classic beauty. Even her most ardent admirers conceded as much. Yet, she was arresting, utterly impossible to ignore. Her dark, intelligent eyes sparked with a restless curiosity and an inner fire. Her voice possessed a quick, musical quality, and her every movement suggested a powerful sense of purpose just barely concealed beneath layers of cultivated, courtly grace. And didn't simply enter rooms. She altered their very gravity, drawing all attention to her without uttering a single demand. At a time when a woman's fate was often irrevocably sealed by the circumstances of her birth and the strategic alliances of her marriage, Anne Boleyn flatly refused to drift quietly into obscurity. She had witnessed firsthand the potent power that charm, intellect, and strategic thinking could wield in the sophisticated foreign courts, and she fully intended to harness that knowledge at home. Anne Boleyn was still a young woman then, undoubtedly clever, fiercely ambitious, and still largely untested, but the great, churning tides of history were already beginning to stir powerfully around her. The girl who returned to England was no longer merely Thomas Boleyn's daughter. She was a formidable player in a far larger, infinitely more dangerous game, one that would soon engulf the crown itself. When Anne Boleyn made her grand return to the English court, she was unlike anyone the cloistered nobility had ever encountered. In a world populated by demure, pale-faced English roses, Anne Boleyn was a sudden, electrifying thunderstorm, unpredictable, magnetic, and utterly impossible to ignore. Her striking dark hair, her bold, expressive eyes, and her quick, rapier-sharp wit instantly set her apart from the gentle, often submissive ladies who filled the court of King Henry VIII. Initially, she played the role expected of her, serving as a maid of honor to the dignified Queen Catherine of Aragon. But even within the Queen's formidable shadow, Anne's presence flickered like a candle too impossibly bright to be snuffed out. She danced with an almost foreign grace, conversed in French with the effortless ease of a native, and, most startlingly, laughed with a self-assured confidence that few women of her era dared to display. Men noticed, drawn by her vivacious spirit and keen intellect. Women gossiped, their whispers a mixture of envy and fascination. The entire court buzzed quietly, captivated by the striking, unconventional Boleyn girl. It was not long before she caught the most dangerous attention of all, that of the king himself. Henry VIII was certainly no stranger to flirtation. His court was a notorious playground of whispered promises, casual dalliances, and secret liaisons. But Anne Boleyn was fundamentally different. She didn't swoon obligingly at his compliments, nor did she fall eagerly into his arms like so many others before her. Instead, she teased him. She challenged his assumptions. Most astonishingly, she refused him. Henry, a man utterly accustomed to instant adoration and unquestioning compliance, was utterly captivated by this bold defiance. The more Anne held him at a tantalizing arm's length, the deeper, more desperate his infatuation became. A torrent of letters passed between them, filled with Henry's fervent declarations of love, his growing frustration, and his consuming longing. Henry, convinced of his power to simply command, offered her the coveted role of royal mistress. arguably the most powerful unofficial position at court, and, with a breathtaking display of strategic audacity, said no. She would not be merely another conquest, a forgotten mistress relegated to the footnotes of history. If Henry truly wanted her, he would have to make her his lawful wife. It was a gamble so audacious, so unprecedented, that it sent shockwaves throughout the entire court. After all, the king was already married to Queen Catherine, a woman beloved by the English people and fiercely protected by her nephew, the mighty Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. The Church itself, the very bedrock of Christendom, would have to be defied and overturned for Henry to claim in. Yet, Anne Boleyn did not flinch. She had spent years immersed in the sophisticated courts of Europe, where queens, often from behind a delicate lace fan or with a carefully painted smile, subtly wielded immense soft power. She understood, with chilling clarity, that ambition was an inherently dangerous game, but it was a game she intended, with every fiber of her being, to win. Standing resolute in the flickering, candlelit halls of the English court, Anne Boleyn made her momentous choice, not simply to be admired, but to irrevocably alter her own destiny and, in doing so, to change England's forever. What had begun as an intense, forbidden flirtation between King Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn soon spiraled into a full-blown national crisis, tearing at the very foundations of the kingdom. Henry was not merely besotted. He was consumed by an all-encompassing obsession. And in the grip of this singular obsession, he was willing to ruthlessly tear apart everything England had known for centuries: its religious ties, its political alliances, its social order. The king's desperate desire to marry Anne, however, hit a rather significant snag. Namely, he was already married to the dignified, resilient, and utterly steadfast Queen Catherine of Aragon. Catherine, for her part, refused to quietly step aside. She had been Henry's faithful wife for 2 long decades, and in the eyes of God, the Pope, and the vast majority of the English people, she remained the rightful, legitimate queen. Divorce, in the 16th century, wasn't just scandalous. It was, for a monarch, almost unthinkable, a direct challenge to divine and worldly order. But Henry, his will as unbending as oak, was utterly determined. He convinced himself, and then aggressively tried to convince everyone else, that his marriage to Catherine was cursed, blighted by God because she had once been briefly married to his deceased brother, Arthur. Never mind that the Pope himself had granted a special dispensation years ago, legitimizing their union. Henry now adamantly insisted that his immortal soul was damned unless he could annul the marriage, and, for her crucial part, knew better than to appear too eager or grasping. She maintained a carefully calculated distance, alternately encouraging Henry's fervent hopes with a glance or a whispered word, while simultaneously maintaining a tantalizing remoteness. Every movement, every glance, every word she uttered was meticulously measured, a calculated step in a grander strategy. She wasn't simply aiming for marriage. She was expertly positioning herself to become the undisputed Queen of England. The court, already a viper's nest of intrigue, erupted into a cacophony of whispers and open factions. Some ambitious noble families eagerly courted Anne's favor, sensing the shifting winds of power and hoping to align themselves with the ascendant star. Others clung fiercely to Queen Catherine, genuinely horrified at the radical idea of and replacing her. Diplomats across Europe frantically wrote desperate letters back to Rome, relaying the explosive situation. Foreign monarchs, particularly Catherine's nephew, the formidable Emperor Charles V, openly threatened devastating retaliation against England if his aunt was discarded. Henry's own trusted advisors shifted uneasily, sensing the ground trembling violently beneath their feet. As months bled into agonizing years, Henry's frustration swelled into a thunderous rage. He bombarded the Pope with endless petitions, subtly maneuvered his lawyers into finding increasingly convoluted loopholes, and slowly, chillingly, began to realize that the Church of Rome would not bend easily to his will. Catherine, after all, had powerful allies, including her nephew, Emperor Charles V, arguably the most powerful man in Europe. Still, Henry pressed on, defying not only wise counsel and centuries of tradition, but increasingly, the very fabric of the law itself. His desperate courtship with and had irrevocably morphed into something far greater than mere personal desire. It had become a direct, existential challenge to the very structure of England's political and religious life. And wasn't just capturing a king's heart. She was, with audacious brilliance, dragging an entire kingdom into uncharted, perilous waters. A dangerous game, indeed, had begun, and there could be no turning back. After nearly 7 agonizing years of relentless maneuvering, escalating scandal, and diplomatic chaos that threatened to engulf all of Europe, and Boleyn's audacious gamble finally paid off. In January 1533, amidst hushed secrecy, she married Henry VIII. It was a breathtakingly bold move, given that he was still technically married to Catherine of Aragon in the eyes of the Pope and a substantial portion of Catholic Europe. By June of that same year, and was crowned Queen of England in a lavish, yet controversially charged, ceremony at Westminster Abbey. It should have been the triumphant crowning moment of her life, the zenith of her ambition, but the atmosphere that day was anything but universally joyful. The weary people of London watched with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. Some cheered dutifully, others muttered fervent prayers for the discarded Queen Catherine, their hearts still loyal to the Spanish princess. Many wondered, with growing apprehension, if this new queen, with her exotic French manners, her daring spirit, and her perceived usurpation, was a blessing or a curse upon the realm, and entered her queenship not as a beloved figure, but as a storm, a disruptive force. Unlike Catherine, who gracefully embodied traditional English values of humility, piety, and quiet dignity, and was dazzling, provocative, and acutely politically savvy. She embraced bold colors and extravagant fashion, commanded the court with sharp intelligence and an almost imperious confidence, and, perhaps inevitably, made powerful enemies with breathtaking speed. Her position, while seemingly secure, was also terrifyingly precarious, balanced precariously on a single, crucial hinge, providing Henry with a legitimate male heir, and knew this as keenly as anyone. She was no longer merely Henry's lover. She was now the fragile hope of a dynasty, the key to the Tudor line's continuation. Early in her pregnancy, and Henry were elated, utterly convinced the child would be the longed-for boy. But in September 1533, and gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth. To Anne's credit, she masked her crushing disappointment with remarkable grace, insisting with forced optimism that the next child would surely be a son. Henry, however, was far less composed. His eyes, once brimming with adoration, now flickered with unmistakable doubt and a chilling disappointment. Still, for a time, Anne's star burned brightly. She began to reshape the English court in her own image, fostering intellectual pursuits, championing new religious ideas, and elevating her family to unprecedented heights of power and influence. She even became the first queen in English history to be crowned with the sacred oil traditionally reserved only for kings, a potent symbol of her unique status. Her influence was vast and undeniable. Foreign ambassadors sought her favor, recognizing her sway over the king. Courtiers reshuffled their alliances, eager to remain in her good graces. The once obedient Henry, driven by his desperate need to legitimize his crown, began moving England officially, irrevocably, away from Rome, establishing the Church of England with himself, not the Pope, at its head. Yet, even in her seeming triumph, dark clouds were inexorably gathering. Friends whispered behind their hands, their loyalty wavering. Rivals, long biding their time, circled like vultures, waiting for any sign of weakness. And Henry, ever fickle, ever restless, was already beginning to look beyond the brilliant, headstrong woman for whom he had so dramatically rewritten the kingdom's destiny, and had won the throne, a monumental achievement. but keeping it would demand far more than charm, ambition, or even love. And Boleyn had soared higher than almost any woman of her era could ever have conceived. But history, with its cruelest lessons, teaches that the higher one rises, the harder and more devastating the fall. Almost from the very moment she placed that heavy crown upon her head, the hairline cracks in her meticulously constructed world began to show. At the heart of Anne's desperate struggles was the crushing, relentless pressure to produce a male heir. Her first child, Elizabeth, though undoubtedly bright and healthy, was not the son upon whom Henry VIII had so fervently hung his dynastic hopes, and the clock, with each passing day, ticked ever louder, and endured multiple pregnancies in quick succession, but each was met with heartbreaking tragedy. Miscarriages followed, leaving her not only physically weakened and vulnerable, but emotionally battered and increasingly isolated. Each lost child chipped away relentlessly at the already fragile foundation she had built with Henry. Henry, once so passionately devoted, now began to visibly pull away, his profound disappointment carving deep, irreparable rifts between them. And, never one to suffer in silence or yield without a fight, argued vehemently, demanded attention, and fought fiercely, desperately, to keep her precarious place. But Henry, a man who prized unquestioning obedience and soothing compliance as much as he valued beauty or wit, grew increasingly tired of her sharpness, her spirited defiance, indeed, the very fire that had once so irresistibly drawn him in. Outside the royal chambers, enemies began to gather like a hungry pack of wolves, sensing her vulnerability. Many conservative nobles who had merely tolerated Anne's meteoric rise with gritted teeth now openly schemed for her downfall. Catherine of Aragon's steadfast supporters never forgave, and for what they perceived as sacrilegious theft and an affront to God. Even commoners whispered against her, reviling her as the great whore and unjustly blaming her for the schism with Rome and the heavy-handed religious changes that followed. And then, insidiously, came Jane Seymour, quiet, demure, and possessing a placid beauty that was everything and was not. Jane subtly captured Henry's wandering attention, just as Anne's once unassailable influence began its inexorable wane. Where Anne had dazzled him with her fierce brilliance and bold challenges, Jane offered soothing compliance and a comforting, unthreatening presence. It was a dangerous, almost imperceptible shift, and Anne, ever perceptive, saw it unfolding with chilling clarity. She desperately tried to reclaim her position, lavishing attention on Henry, promising more sons, begging for his patience and affection. But the king, ever fickle, ever driven by his own desires, had already begun imagining a life without the woman for whom he had once torn a kingdom apart. Anne's powerful political enemies, including Thomas Cromwell, once her most indispensable ally, acutely sensed the changing tide. They began laying the insidious groundwork for a campaign of utter destruction, quietly gathering fabricated accusations, malicious rumors, and coerced witnesses. The woman who had played the dangerous game of ambition so masterfully, who had bent a king to her will, was now losing ground, slowly but surely, and had won her crown through sheer cunning and breathtaking courage. But in the brutal, shifting world of Henry's court, past victories meant little. Only fresh success, a renewed favor, truly mattered. And Anne's enemies were sharpening their knives, preparing for the kill. The queen who had dared to shatter a kingdom would soon discover how quickly a kingdom, once united against her, could shatter her in return. And Boleyn's enemies didn't attack her with marching armies or flashing swords. They came instead with insidious whispers, carefully guarded secrets, and meticulously sharpened lies. In the shadowy back rooms of the court, a betrayal of monumental proportions was brewing, silent, patient, and utterly deadly. Thomas Cromwell, once Anne's greatest ally in the tumultuous English Reformation, had turned against her. Their formidable alliance had been forged on mutual ambition and shared reformist zeal, but now their diverging interests clashed violently. And, with her passionate convictions, desired genuine reforms to aid the poor and curb the unchecked power of greedy nobles. Cromwell, ever the pragmatist, craved stability, unwavering favor with Henry, and no inconvenient interference. Anne's boldness, her independent mind, her relentless pursuit of a male heir, had ultimately made her dangerous. And in Henry's fickle, volatile heart, what was once a consuming love had curdled into bitter irritation, chilling suspicion, and profound, cold detachment. And, isolated and increasingly vulnerable, had few true friends left. Even her charm, once her greatest weapon, now grated against the court's growing hunger for a gentler, more pliable queen. And Jane Seymour, quiet and calculating, waited patiently just out of sight, the perfect, unthreatening contrast to Anne's fading, tempestuous fire. It was Cromwell who made the first decisive move. Knowing Henry's restlessness, acutely aware that the king desperately wanted an exit from his marriage but lacked a convenient, legally plausible excuse, Cromwell offered a chilling solution. What if and could be removed not by a messy, humiliating divorce, which would only expose Henry's capriciousness and further alienate European powers, but by irreparable disgrace? The accusations were wild, monstrous, utterly unbelievable to any objective observer. Adultery with multiple men, including her own brother, George Bullen, high treason, a nefarious conspiracy against the king himself, and the proud, brilliant queen who had dared to redefine the crown, was now meticulously painted as a betrayer, a Jezebel-like temptress, a mortal threat to the very stability of the realm. Cromwell meticulously gathered his evidence, coercing confessions under brutal torture, twisting innocent courtly flirtations into damning testimony. Several prominent men, including Anne's beloved brother, George Bullen, were arrested and subjected to his cruel interrogations. The charges, upon closer inspection, made little to no sense. They were riddled with blatant contradictions and glaring impossibilities. But in Henry's despotic court, truth was a fluid concept, whatever the king expediently needed it to be. And, sensing the tightening noose, fought with the desperation of a cornered lioness. She appealed to Henry's fading memory, to the intense love and shared ambition they had once nurtured, but it was utterly no use. The man who had once torn England apart for her now steadfastly refused to meet her eyes. In early May 1536, Anne Bullen was arrested and ignominiously escorted to the dreaded Tower of London. As the great, heavy gates slammed shut behind her, echoing with a chilling finality, she knew the stark, brutal truth. She was no longer a queen. She was a prisoner, a mere pawn trapped in the brutal, unforgiving game she had once played so masterfully. Betrayal, cold and calculated, had sealed her agonizing fate. And now, alone in the ancient stone walls of the tower, Anne Bullen waited for the final, inevitable move. Anne Bullen stood resolute in the great hall of the Tower of London, facing a tribunal composed of nobles, many of whom owed their very titles, their vast fortunes, and their influence directly to her meteoric rise. Now, with chilling dispassion, they sat in judgment, cold and watchful, meticulously prepared to erase the woman who had once, with such daring, altered the destiny of England. The charges leveled against her were indeed shocking, almost unprecedented in their depravity: adultery with multiple men, including the horrifying accusation of incest with her own brother, George Bullen, high treason, and a heinous conspiracy against the king. In any other world, such monstrous accusations against a reigning queen would have been unthinkable, an affront to divine order. But here, in Henry's court, now, they were merely theater, a grim, meticulously choreographed performance designed to give Henry VIII precisely what he craved: Anne's downfall, neatly wrapped in a thin, utterly transparent veil of legality. And, ever the formidable intellect, defended herself with the same fierce fire and devastating wit that had once captivated Henry's heart. She denied every single accusation with incisive intelligence, precise detail, and an unwavering composure that astonished even her most hardened enemies. She reminded them, with quiet dignity, that she had been crowned with sacred oil, chosen by God himself, and anointed as the Queen of England. She reminded them of her unswerving loyalty, her personal sacrifices, her profound, albeit now broken, love for the king. But it was all tragically for nothing. The verdict had been sealed, irrevocably decided, long before and had even set foot in that cavernous courtroom. The trial itself was a grotesque spectacle, designed as much for the court as for the general populace, a public unmaking of a once unbreakable woman. Witness after witness, many clearly coerced, some undoubtedly bribed, spoke damning words that twisted truth into grotesque caricature. Dates and places flagrantly contradicted each other. The evidence was flimsy, almost non-existent when it was scrutinized. But the truth was utterly irrelevant now, and Bullen was found guilty. Her brother George, and the other unfortunate men accused alongside her, were also sentenced to death, and herself would be executed by beheading, a small, chilling mercy compared to the usual traitor's death of hanging, drawing, and quartering. When the verdict was read, her face pale but her spirit fiercely intact, and did not break. She stood tall, unbowed. In those agonizing final moments before being led back to her dank cell, she spoke clearly, her voice steady, declaring that she was prepared to die and praying that God would have mercy on her soul. As the heavy doors of the hall closed behind her, the court exhaled in a collective sigh of relief. The storm that and Bullen had embodied, brilliant, dangerous, unforgettable, was, they believed, nearly over. But even then, they did not truly understand. They were not erasing and Bullen. They were, in their betrayal and in this profound tragedy, immortalizing her in legend. After her sham trial, and Bullen was returned to the grim confines of the Tower of London, no longer the triumphant queen who had once commanded England's destiny, but a condemned prisoner, awaiting an ignominious death. Yet, even facing the ultimate end, and refused to crumble. In the cold, echoing halls of the ancient tower, and prepared herself with an almost serene dignity. She spent hours in fervent prayer, kneeling on the hard, unforgiving stone floors, her hands clasped tightly, her voice remarkably steady. She confessed to no crimes because, in her heart, she believed she had committed none. She was not afraid to die, she declared to her few remaining loyal ladies, but she prayed earnestly that her death would bring a fragile peace to the kingdom and perhaps a lasting mercy to her beloved, innocent daughter, Elizabeth. Her ladies-in-waiting, those precious few who had remained steadfastly loyal despite the danger, wept in private, their grief profound, and, with incredible strength, comforted them instead of the other way around. She even joked, with a flash of her old, dark humor, that she would surely be remembered as a queen who had literally lost her head. In that bitter jest lay the stubborn, indomitable spark that had made her unforgettable, a spirit that even death could not extinguish. Henry VIII, meanwhile, showed no genuine sign of mercy. His attention had already irrevocably turned to Jane Seymour, the demure contrast to Anne's fiery spirit. Even before Anne's execution date was finalized, Henry was already making meticulous arrangements for his next marriage, his mind already set on the future. For Anne, this final, chilling betrayal from the man who had once torn down an entire kingdom for her, who had risked his soul and his crown for her love, must have been the deepest, most agonizing cut of all. On May 18, 1536, Anne was informed that she would die the very next morning. She slept little that night, if at all. Instead, she spent her final hours in profound prayer, asking God for forgiveness for all who had wronged her, and perhaps, for herself, for the ambition and the pride that had ultimately led her to this harrowing precipice. Henry, in a fleeting flicker of what he considered royal kindness, had arranged for a skilled French swordsman to carry out the execution, a swifter, cleaner, less brutal death than the customary English axe. It was a small mercy, bought perhaps more for the appeasement of the king's conscience than for Anne's comfort. At dawn, and dressed meticulously and carefully for her final, public moment, a dark gray gown of damask, exquisitely trimmed with fur, worn over a crimson kirtle, colors of dignity, of sacrifice, and of the blood she would soon shed. She pinned up her iconic dark hair and tucked it neatly beneath a simple cap, ready to face the blade with an almost ethereal grace. As the tower's cold morning mist curled around the ancient courtyard stones, and Bullen, queen, mother, survivor, fighter, stepped forward. There would be no tears, no desperate pleas for clemency, only a final, profound act of courage in the unblinking face of history's judgment. Her end was indeed near, but her story, her indelible legacy, was just beginning. On the fateful morning of May 19th, 1536, and Bullen ascended the scaffold, erected starkly within the Tower of London's formidable walls. A small, hushed crowd had gathered, courtiers, guards, a select few witnesses, all wrapped in a collective, suffocating silence, as if even the ancient stone walls held their breath in anticipation, and stood tall, her gray gown fluttering slightly in the cold morning breeze. She appeared thinner than she had at court, her face pale but strikingly calm, devoid of any trace of hysteria or broken sobs. If anything, she faced death with the same fierce dignity that had once shaken a kingdom to its very knees. She spoke briefly, her final words carefully chosen, meticulously crafted. She did not accuse her enemies. She did not passionately defend herself against the baseless charges. Instead, in an act of breathtaking magnanimity, she prayed for the king's continued health and prosperity, the very man who had so utterly abandoned and condemned her. In those final, poignant moments, and offered the world not a confession of guilt, but a profound gesture of forgiveness. Her raw courage stunned even those who had come specifically to witness her fall. The French executioner, brought specially from Calais to ensure a swift, clean death, stepped forward and knelt upright, her hands folded in prayer, her eyes lifted toward the heavens in silent communion. A small white cloth was gently tied around her eyes, a final veil. She remained utterly still. The sword flashed once, silent, swift, and in Bullen, queen, mother, history maker, was no more. She was buried quickly, ignominiously, in an unmarked grave within the tower grounds, laid to rest in a hastily prepared arrow chest because no proper coffin had been readied for her. A queen, once crowned in glittering gold, now left to vanish without ceremony, without even a proper gravestone. Yet, and story could not, end in that cold, anonymous grave. Her daughter, Elizabeth, the child whose birth had once so bitterly disappointed a king and set in motion her mother's tragic fate, would rise against all odds to become one of the greatest, most celebrated monarchs in English history. Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, whose glorious reign would see the flourishing of English art, the dramatic expansion of its power, and the indelible imprint of its global influence. A queen who inherited her mother's fierce spirit, her sharp, incisive mind, and her unyielding resilience, transforming these qualities into the very bedrock of a golden age. And Bullen, through her ambition and her sacrifice, changed the course of England forever. Her audacious will help trigger the cataclysmic break with Rome and the birth of the Church of England, reshaping the spiritual and political landscape of a nation. Her dramatic fall brutally showed the world that even queens, regardless of their power, could be cast aside. Yet, through her blood, through the extraordinary reign of her daughter Elizabeth, Anne's legacy blazed brighter, more enduringly, than any crown she had worn in life. In the end, Anne Boleyn achieved a kind of immortality, not through her own survival, but through her profound, indelible impact on the unfolding drama of history itself. By the early 1770s, the American colonies simmered with a dangerous, slow-burning resentment, much like a pot left too long over a roaring fire, threatening to boil over. The relationship with Great Britain, once cherished and revered as the proud mother country, had soured into a toxic brew of deep-seated resentment, gnawing suspicion, and growing fury. This escalating tension hadn't merely started with the infamous tea. Its roots ran much deeper. Years earlier, the notorious Stamp Act had enraged colonists across the 13 colonies by imposing direct taxes on nearly every piece of paper, from legal documents and newspapers to almanacs, and even playing cards. That punitive measure was soon followed by the equally reviled Townshend Acts, which levied duties on essential imported goods like paper, glass, lead, and paint. Each new, burdensome law, passed thousands of miles away by a distant parliament in which the colonists had absolutely no direct representation, felt like another spark landing in dry, highly combustible brush, inching them closer to an inevitable conflagration. At first, the burgeoning anger manifested itself in polite, yet firm, petitions and eloquently fiery pamphlets penned by passionate advocates for liberty. Colonial assemblies, though often constrained, drafted formal protests to the crown. Merchants, unified in their economic grievances, organized widespread boycotts of British goods, hoping to hit Parliament where it truly hurt, in the pocketbook. Eloquent writers like Samuel Adams and John Dickinson filled colonial newspapers with passionate, carefully reasoned arguments about fundamental rights and the sacred principles of liberty. But as time wore on, as each polite entreaty was met with indifference or, worse, renewed coercion, frustration deepened into something far more dangerous and profound. A slow, agonizing realization began to dawn upon many colonists. Britain wasn't truly listening to their grievances. Even more disheartening, Britain didn't seem to care about their plight or their rights. Many loyal colonists desperately clung to the fragile hope that if they just made enough noise, if they just reasoned hard enough and persistently enough, Parliament would eventually see the error of its ways and repeal the oppressive taxes. And sometimes, surprisingly, they did. The Stamp Act, for instance, was famously repealed after vociferous colonial protest, offering a fleeting, deceptive glimmer of hope that rational dialogue could still prevail. But every minor concession, every fleeting repeal, was swiftly followed by a fresh wave of legislation, new taxes, and renewed insults. The core issue was never truly about the monetary cost. The levies themselves were, by British standards, surprisingly modest. What truly ignited the colonial fury was the principle, the audacious assertion of power over people who lacked representation. They were being taxed without consent, systematically diminished from citizens to mere subjects, treated as distant, voiceless possessions rather than equal partners in the burgeoning empire. Boston, a city already seething with a history of dissent, became the crucible of this resistance. More than any other urban center, it pulsated as the beating heart of defiance. The Sons of Liberty, a clandestine yet increasingly audacious group of patriots, amplified their calls for action, their whispers growing into roars. In 1770, the simmering tensions catastrophically erupted into violence when British soldiers, provoked or not, fired upon unarmed civilians in what became infamously known as the Boston Massacre. Blood had already stained the ancient cobblestones, a stark and unforgettable crimson. Trust, once a delicate thread, had irrevocably snapped, becoming a relic of a bygone era. By 1773, the American colonies collectively found themselves teetering precariously on the precipice of open rebellion. It was clear that one final affront would push them over the edge, and it arrived not in the thunder of cannons or the marching of new armies, but in the quiet, almost benign form of crates stacked with tea. Unbeknownst to the colonists at the time, the frigid December night that saw that tea sink beneath the cold, dark waters of Boston Harbor would forever alter the course of human history. In 1773, the British Parliament, steeped in an almost colonial arrogance, made a monumental miscalculation. Convinced that the American colonists would readily embrace economic advantage, they passed the Tea Act. This legislation was ostensibly designed to rescue the beleaguered British East India Company from financial ruin, but it served a dual, unspoken purpose: to unequivocally reassert Britain's dominion and its undisputed right to tax its distant colonies. On paper, It appeared to be an undeniably attractive proposition. The Tea Act granted the powerful East India Company a monopoly, allowing it to bypass colonial middlemen, slash prices, and sell its luxury tea directly to American consumers at an unprecedented bargain, mere pennies cheaper than before. From London's detached perspective, it was a win-win. What, they wondered, could possibly go wrong? Everything. The profound error lay in Parliament's fundamental misunderstanding of colonial grievances. The heart of the matter wasn't the price of tea, but the deeply ingrained principle that underpinned it. Crucially, the Tea Act left the detested tax on tea, the very symbol of taxation without representation, firmly in place. To accept this cheaper tea, even at a significant discount, would have been to tacitly acknowledge Parliament's perceived right to levy taxes on the colonies without their explicit consent. For countless Americans, this was an utterly unthinkable capitulation, a profound surrender of the very liberties they had passionately fought to protect and assert for more than a decade. The news of the Tea Act, carried by swift riders and hastily printed broadsides, spread like wildfire across the colonies, igniting a fresh wave of outrage. Colonial merchants, facing the imminent threat of financial ruin, fumed with indignation. They saw their livelihoods imperiled by a state-backed monopoly that would inevitably crush local trade and honest enterprise. Patriots, ever vigilant, raged at the veiled message woven into the legislation. The Crown, they realized, still firmly believed it could act with impunity, dictating terms to its subjects across the Atlantic. In Boston, a city already scarred by the fresh memory of the Boston Massacre and enduring years of economic hardship, the reaction was particularly vehement. Bostonians, acutely aware of imperial manipulation, recognized the Tea Act for what it truly was, an insidious trap, cleverly disguised as a benevolent bargain. Refusing the tea thus became more than an act of protest. It transformed into a sacred matter of honor, a crucial litmus test for one's loyalty to the burgeoning cause of liberty itself. Public meetings swelled with impassioned citizens, their numbers growing exponentially. Newspaper columns, fueled by an increasingly radical press, burned with fiery rhetoric, denouncing tyranny and rallying resistance. Influential groups like the Sons of Liberty, spearheaded by charismatic figures such as Samuel Adams, swiftly organized widespread boycotts, vowing with grim determination that no East India Company tea would be permitted to be unloaded, sold, or consumed on American soil. All along the colonial coastline, ships laden with the controversial tea were met with organized resistance and forcibly turned away by determined local patriots. In bustling ports from New York to Charleston, the message resonated with unmistakable clarity. We will not be bought. But in Boston, destiny, it seemed, was about to take a far more dramatic and decisive twist. 3 such tea ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, managed to reach Boston Harbor, where they anchored defiantly, their captains under strict orders not to depart without unloading their valuable cargo. Royal officials, steadfast in their adherence to Crown authority, insisted the tea be brought ashore. The resolute colonists, equally firm in their stance, refused. A tense, suffocating deadlock settled over the city, taut as a drawn bowstring, its unseen vibrations palpable in the crisp autumn air. The tension was not merely unbearable. It was a living, breathing entity, pressing down on every soul in Boston. It was understood, by all, that a single act, a definitive breaking point, was imminent, and when it came, history would never again be the same. As these British tea ships sat stubbornly anchored, their hulls reflecting the gray skies of Boston Harbor, the city itself became a massive, volatile powder keg, ready to explode. With each passing day that brought no resolution, the pressure mounted, tightening its grip on the populace. Boston wasn't merely resisting, it was actively preparing for an inevitable confrontation. In dimly lit taverns, solemn churches, and bustling public squares, angry colonists engaged in passionate, often whispered, debates about their next move. The Sons of Liberty, their ranks bolstered by fiery orators like Samuel Adams, the wealthy merchant John Hancock, and the renowned silversmith Paul Revere, moved with swift, clandestine efficiency to organize and consolidate the burgeoning resistance. They posted urgent public notices, boldly calling upon all citizens to boycott British tea, and convened raucous meetings that swelled with a diverse cross-section of society: farmers, skilled artisans, and powerful merchants alike. Each gathering, each impassioned speech, added more fuel to the already roaring fire of colonial discontent. The venerable Old South Meeting House, its wooden beams steeped in generations of civic discourse, transformed into the very nerve center of this burgeoning resistance movement. Thousands of defiant colonists crammed into its hallowed hall, their collective breath fogging the air, their voices rising in a unified chorus of outright defiance. Here, resolutions were vehemently passed, stirring speeches were delivered to thunderous applause, and tempers, already frayed, boiled over with righteous anger. Each vote cast against the unloading of the tea was not merely a procedural act, but a resounding hammer blow against the very foundations of British authority. Yet, while the people of Boston stood largely united in their resolve, the relentless clock of British law was inexorably ticking. Implacable British statutes mandated that imported goods, such as the tea now languishing in the harbor, had to be unloaded and the associated tax paid within a mere 20 days of a ship's arrival. If the vessels remained in port beyond this strict deadline, customs officials were legally empowered to seize the entire cargo, and the much-hated tax would then be forcibly collected. The Sons of Liberty understood the dire implications with chilling clarity. Once that tax was paid, even under the loudest protest, the fundamental principle they fought for, no taxation without representation, would be irretrievably lost. This struggle, they realized, had transcended mere tea. It had become an existential question of whether the colonies would passively accept being treated as subjects devoid of rights, or whether they would stand united and fight, defiantly, for their very future. Meanwhile, his royal governor of Massachusetts, Thomas Hutchinson, remained utterly unyielding, digging in his heels with stubborn conviction. He adamantly refused to permit the tea ships to depart Boston Harbor without first unloading their cargo, issuing stern demands that the law, as he interpreted it, be obeyed without question. Colonial outrage be damned, was his unspoken mantra. To Hutchinson, any backing down, any concession to the boisterous crowds, would be tantamount to admitting that mobs, rather than the divinely appointed monarch, held sway over the colonies. Boston's tense standoff thus transformed into a captivating spectacle, a drama playing out on a global stage. Every man, woman, and child in the city, from the humblest apprentice to the most affluent merchant, instinctively knew that something momentous was coming. You could feel it in the very air itself, that cold, sharp, almost anticipatory stillness that precedes a great storm, when the entire world seems to hold its collective breath. All it would take, everyone sensed, was one tiny spark to ignite an explosion that would echo through history. And somewhere, amidst the crowded streets and the equally crowded, fervent hearts of Bostonians, a monumental decision was quietly taking shape, a plan destined to reverberate across oceans and fundamentally shake the foundations of empires. December 16, 1773, dawned gray and cold over Boston, a city poised precariously on the razor's edge of history. For nearly 3 agonizing weeks, the tea ships had sat like ticking bombs in the heart of Boston Harbor, their presence a constant, silent provocation. Now, the final, inexorable deadline had arrived. According to the letter of British law, the tea had to be unloaded and the associated tax paid within 20 days of a ship's arrival. If this mandate was not met, customs officials were fully authorized to seize the cargo, and more ominously, British troops could be summoned to enforce the law by force. Everyone in Boston knew the stakes. Everyone understood the profound gravity of the moment. If that tea came ashore, even a single chest, the principle, the very foundation of colonial liberty, would be irrevocably lost. if the colonists allowed it. Even this once, their entire cause, their hard-won claim to rights and autonomy, would unravel like a threadbare cloth. That morning, thousands upon thousands of Bostonians, joined by colonists who had trudged for miles through the icy countryside, packed into the Old South Meeting House, the largest public building in town. The assembly was so densely packed that men spilled out into the frigid streets, straining to catch every fiery speech echoing through the historic halls. Samuel Adams, his voice an iron bell of rebellion, presided over the charged gathering. Speaker after speaker rose to denounce the Tea Act with passionate fervor, to cry out against the tyrannical overreach of Parliament, and to urge immediate, decisive action. Yet, even amidst such resounding defiance, an undercurrent of profound uncertainty hung heavy in the air. What could truly be done, many wondered, without igniting an outright war, a conflict they might not survive? How could they effectively stop the tea without opening the floodgates to brutal British retaliation? As the long afternoon wore on, riders, their horses lathered with sweat, galloped in with grim tidings. Governor Thomas Hutchinson, staunch and unyielding, remained unmoved. His decree was absolute. The ships would not be allowed to leave without unloading. The tea, he declared, would be seized, the tax collected, and the king's law enforced, no matter the cost. The massive crowd within the meeting house buzzed with a rising fury, a low, ominous hum that grew into a crescendo. The very walls of the ancient meeting house seemed to shudder, vibrating with the sheer force of their collective indignation. Yet, Samuel Adams, a figure of remarkable composure amidst the storm, stood calmly and spoke the words that irrevocably signaled the end of all debate. This meeting can do nothing more to save the country. A simple, unassuming sentence. But everyone present, every man and woman straining to hear, understood its profound, earth-shattering meaning. There would be no more polite petitions, no more fruitless compromises. The time for words was over. Action, daring and definitive, would now be taken. Outside, a chilling war whoop suddenly cut through the gathering gloom, piercing the tense air. It was the signal. Men, anticipating this moment, quickly began to disguise themselves, smearing soot on their faces, donning rough blankets and crude arrangements of feathers in a symbolic, rather than literal, imitation of Mohawk warriors. The intent was never to truly deceive anyone. It was about forging a powerful, unmistakable symbol, a message of indigenous-inspired defiance that no one, neither colonist nor crown, could possibly mistake. The deadline, after all, had passed. Boston would now answer, not with carefully penned words, but with an audacious, unforgettable act of rebellion. As twilight deepened over Boston on that fateful December 16, 1773, the usually bustling streets began to stir with an unusual, purposeful quiet. Figures moved through the deepening shadows, ordinary men, cloaked in rough woolen blankets, their faces deliberately blackened with soot, some adorned with feathers in a symbolic gesture. They made no pretense of trying to fool anyone into believing they were actual Mohawk warriors. Their disguise was purely symbolic, an act of shedding their former identities, of taking a unified stand as something entirely new, something fierce and unyielding. By the dozens, then scores, they silently made their way towards Griffin's Wharf, where the three British tea ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, lay ominously anchored. The harbor water beneath them churned cold and dark, thick with the sharp, biting chill of winter air, reflecting the somber mood of the impending act. There was no shouting, no drunken revelry, no chaotic disorder. This was emphatically not a riot. It was a carefully orchestrated mission, carried out with calm, ruthless precision. Armed primarily with hatchets and clubs, the disguised colonists swarmed aboard the ships, quickly overwhelming the few unsuspecting crew members still aboard. No harm came to the sailors. They were simply pushed aside, forced to watch in stunned silence as the audacious operation commenced. Men split open the heavy wooden chests with practiced, powerful blows. The rich, fragrant aroma of fresh tea spilling into the cold night air, a scent that would forever be associated with rebellion. Others heaved the opened crates overboard, their heavy splashes echoing across the still, dark waters of the harbor, each sound a deliberate statement of defiance. Chest after chest, an astonishing 342 in total, was systematically broken open and dumped, until the black water swirled with thousands upon thousands of pounds of precious tea leaves. Spectators, a silent, awestruck crowd, watched from the wharf, their breath clouding in the frigid air. Remarkably, British guards stationed nearby made no move to intervene, their muskets gleaming idly in the dim light. Whether their inaction stemmed from confusion, a nascent sympathy for the colonial cause, or simply a prudent fear of dangerously escalating the violence, remains unclear to this day. Some accounts even suggest that among certain British loyalists observing the scene, there was a profound, unspoken understanding. Something fundamental had irrevocably shifted this night, and there would be no stopping it. The discipline displayed was truly extraordinary. No other cargo was stolen. No one dared to raid the ships for valuables, despite the widespread economic hardship that gripped Boston. Only the tea, that hated symbol of British oppression and unfair taxation, was targeted. In a town where hunger and desperate circumstances were daily realities, the men could have easily transformed the protest into a convenient excuse for widespread looting. They did not. When the meticulously planned act was finally complete, the harbor resembled a vast, swirling cauldron, filled with torn wooden chests and countless soaking tea leaves. The familiar scent of the sea now mixed with the sharp, distinctive tang of crushed tea, filling the night air with a strange, bittersweet aroma of defiance. The work was done. Silently, as they had arrived, the disguised men vanished back into the night, melting away into the labyrinthine alleys and dark back streets of Boston. They left behind no names, no identifiable leaders, no claims to individual fame, only the unmistakable, indelible mark of a burgeoning revolution. As the last splintered crates bobbed defiantly in the dark, swirling waters, Boston itself seemed to hold its breath, hushed and still. The Boston Tea Party was not a chaotic riot, a drunken brawl, or a spectacle of wanton destruction. It was something far rarer and infinitely more profound, an act of cold, calculated, and utterly deliberate defiance, executed with chilling precision under the cloak of a winter night. The entire harbor had been transformed into a colossal, simmering teapot, its surface now an undulating tapestry of black. Thousands of pounds of East India Company tea floated in great, sodden mats on the water, staining it a murky, indelible black. Some curious, perhaps opportunistic, colonists attempted to scoop handfuls of the soaked leaves from the harbor's edge, only to be sharply chastised and firmly turned away by members of the Sons of Liberty, who patrolled the docks to enforce the protest's integrity. Nothing, they insisted, was to be salvaged. No one would be permitted to profit from the night's momentous work. This, they declared, was an act of pure, unadulterated principle, simple and absolute. The town woke the next morning to the peculiar, pervasive smell of salty tea hanging heavy in the crisp morning air, an olfactory reminder of the night's daring. News spread like wildfire, carried by word of mouth, hastily written letters, and hastily printed broadsheets. By midday, everyone, from the lowliest apprentice to the most influential merchant, knew precisely what had transpired. And opinions, predictably, split fast and deep. Among patriots, there was a surge of profound pride, a fierce, swelling exultation that ordinary men had stood up to the mightiest empire in the world and struck such a bold, undeniable blow for liberty. Among loyalists and cautious moderates, however, there was unbridled horror. To them, the destruction of such vast private property was seen as reckless, dangerous, and a terrifying escalation. Had the colonies, they whispered fearfully, crossed a line from which there could be no return? Governor Thomas Hutchinson, trapped in his stately mansion, raged with a furious indignation, incensed not only by the sheer destruction of property, but, more significantly, by the brazen, defiant message it broadcast. If the king's sacred authority could be so flagrantly defied in Boston, where else, he worried, might the flames of rebellion unexpectedly spark? British officials in London were utterly stunned. They had anticipated protests, perhaps renewed boycotts, even another riot akin to those that had flared up over the Stamp Act. They had certainly not expected an organized, disciplined corps of revolutionaries to calmly and systematically destroy tens of thousands of pounds sterling worth of royal property without so much as breaking a single window on the ships. The captains of the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver could only watch, helpless and aghast, as their valuable cargo vanished beneath the waves. In the official ledgers, the financial loss for the East India Company would be tallied at well over £10,000 British pounds, a veritable fortune in those days. But the true, immeasurable loss was not to be quantified in pounds sterling or ruined tea leaves. It was measured in the shattered remnants of trust, in the erosion of loyalty, in the fragile illusion that Britain still ruled her colonies with their consent. The night the tea sank, something far deeper, far more significant, rose to the surface, a shared, undeniable truth. The age of peaceful, deferential protest was unequivocally ending. A reckoning was coming, and Boston, hardened by years of oppression, was ready to meet it head-on. When word of the Boston Tea Party finally crossed the vast Atlantic and reached the hallowed halls of London, the reaction was swift, severe, and absolutely furious. To British officials, this was no mere protest. It was an act of overt rebellion, an open, mocking challenge to royal authority that, they believed, simply could not be ignored. King George III, upon hearing the news, was reportedly seized by a chilling, profound anger. Parliament, already frustrated and exasperated by years of colonial disobedience and perceived insolence, exploded in a collective outrage. They demanded not just punishment for the rebellious city of Boston, but a stark, undeniable warning to all the American colonies. The result was a series of legislative acts so harsh, so punitive, that they were quickly and contemptuously nicknamed the Intolerable Acts in America. The first blow landed swiftly and with devastating force, the Boston Port Act. In one brutal, sweeping stroke, Parliament ordered the immediate closure of Boston's bustling harbor, the very economic lifeline of the city, until the destroyed tea was fully paid for and order, as defined by Britain, was unequivocally restored. Ships could no longer enter or leave. Trade vanished overnight. Vital goods and supplies dried up. Boston, once a vibrant, noisy hub of commerce, grew eerily quiet, its docks deserted and hauntingly still. But the punishment did not stop there. The Massachusetts Government Act savagely stripped the colony of its cherished self-governing rights, placing it firmly under the heavy hand of the king's appointed officials. The Administration of Justice Act allowed royal officials accused of crimes within the colonies to be tried back in Britain, effectively ensuring they could escape colonial justice. A clear, contemptuous message that British authorities considered themselves untouchable. And to ensure the colonies fully grasped that military force was always an option, British soldiers were aggressively quartered throughout Boston, forced to live among the very citizens they were meant to subdue and control. The message from London was chillingly clear: rebellion would be crushed. Liberty, Parliament declared, was a luxury the Crown would no longer tolerate, certainly not for these ungrateful colonists. However, Parliament's heavy-handed tactics had a profound and utterly unintended effect. Instead of cowering the other colonies into submission, these punitive measures merely outraged them. News of Boston's suffering, its vital port closed, its people facing starvation under what was effectively martial law, stirred a deep wellspring of sympathy and righteous anger throughout the entirety of America. Wagon loads of food, essential supplies, and heartfelt letters of support poured into Boston from neighboring colonies, a tangible demonstration of burgeoning solidarity. Pledges of unity and secret meetings began to weave the once fragmented colonies closer together, transforming what had historically been a localized Massachusetts problem into a rapidly escalating American one. In seeking to punish Boston and make a fearsome example of it, Britain had, ironically, forged Boston into a powerful symbol, a rallying cry for widespread resistance. The flames of revolution, once flickering tentatively in isolated pockets of dissent, now began to blaze uncontrollably from colony to colony, and there would be no easy extinguishing them. The harsh punishment inflicted upon Boston sent shock waves far beyond the rocky shores of Massachusetts. Across all 13 colonies, outrage swiftly transformed into something far more perilous for Great Britain: genuine unity. For decades, the American colonies had behaved much like distant, bickering cousins, frequently competing, often isolated by vast geography, diverse religious practices, and fierce trade rivalries. Yet, when Parliament slammed Boston's harbor shut and brutally stripped Massachusetts of its fundamental right to self-governance, Americans across the vast continent experienced a chilling realization. If it could happen to Boston, it could, and likely would, happen to anyone. From the sun-drenched plantations of Virginia to the bustling markets of Pennsylvania, from the rice fields of South Carolina to the rugged coastline of New Hampshire, the response was swift and decisive. Colonists, driven by a burgeoning sense of shared identity and fate, dispatched wagons brimming with food, vital supplies, and impassioned letters of solidarity to the suffering people of Boston. Town meetings buzzed with a simmering anger that threatened to boil over. Newspaper printers, working day and night, labored tirelessly to spread the urgent news and galvanize public opinion. The fight, it was now unequivocally clear, was no longer Boston's alone. It had become everyone's. And so, in September 1774, something truly unprecedented occurred. The First Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia. For the very first time in their history, representatives from 12 of the 13 colonies gathered under one roof, united by a shared purpose, to discuss and forge a unified response to what they perceived as British tyranny. Men like the stoic George Washington, the fiery orator Patrick Henry, the intellectual John Adams, and the relentless revolutionary Samuel Adams, once merely regional figures, now stood together, shoulder to shoulder, as the nascent architects of a movement that was growing larger, bolder, and more cohesive with each passing day. Their stated goal, at least officially, was not yet full independence. Most still clung to a desperate hope for reconciliation, for a return to the good old days of mutual respect and constitutional liberty under the British Crown. But beneath the polite debates and carefully worded petitions, a deeper, more profound understanding was irrevocably taking root. The colonies could no longer afford to stand separately, isolated, and vulnerable. At the Congress, they forged a powerful agreement, a sweeping, coordinated boycott of all British goods. They pledged mutual support in the face of any further British aggression, issuing a clear, resonant declaration that any attack on one colony would henceforth be considered an attack on all. In taverns and meeting houses across the continent, ordinary people, once hesitant, now began to openly use words that had until recently been whispered only in the deepest privacy: unity, resistance, liberty. In bringing down the hammer of the intolerable acts upon Boston, Britain had foolishly imagined it would crush the rebellious spirit. Instead, it had welded the disparate colonies together into something far more dangerous to imperial power. A people who, despite their profound differences, were now beginning to think of themselves not as scattered provinces, but, unequivocally, as Americans. The winds of revolution, once merely stirring a few leaves, were no longer just gathering. They were coalescing into an unstoppable storm. And for Britain, it was already far too late to stop it. The night the tea sank into Boston Harbor, it wasn't merely crates of costly leaves that were destroyed. It was the cherished illusion that the American colonies could forever remain loyal, obedient subjects of the British Crown. The Boston Tea Party lit a spark, an incandescent ember that no king, no army, no distant parliament, however powerful, could ever hope to extinguish. In the tumultuous months that followed, that spark swiftly caught fire, igniting a raging inferno of defiance across all the colonies. What had once been sporadic protests, organized boycotts, and carefully phrased petitions hardened into open, undisguised resistance. Town militias, once quiet and informal, began drilling openly in village greens, their movements becoming sharper, more purposeful. Storehouses quickly filled with precious powder and shot. Men who had once raised their glasses to toast King George III in taverns now, under those very same roofs, whispered fervently about revolution, about casting off the chains of empire. Boston, battered but unbowed, became a powerful symbol of colonial sacrifice and unwavering resolve. The more aggressively Britain attempted to tighten its suffocating grip, the more inexplicably the colonies seemed to slip through its fingers like water. Every British ship that sailed past the closed, silent, and hauntingly empty harbor of Boston served as a poignant, silent reminder that tyranny had finally met its match in American defiance. When Parliament passed the draconian Intolerable Acts, their explicit intention was to make a fearsome example out of Boston, to terrify the other colonies into immediate submission. Instead, they had inadvertently created a martyr city, a potent rallying cry that resonated across the continent. From the sun-drenched fields of Georgia to the rugged coasts of New Hampshire, colonists realized with startling clarity that their fates were inextricably tied together. Resistance, they understood, was no longer simply about tea. It was about sheer survival, about nascent identity, and, ultimately, about fundamental freedom. By the spring of 1775, the pervasive tension reached a volatile boiling point just outside Boston. In the quiet, unassuming villages of Lexington and Concord, British troops, dispatched with the explicit mission to confiscate colonial weapons, instead encountered armed farmers, ordinary men ready to defend their inherent rights with musket fire. The first shots of the American Revolution rang out, their echoes reverberating through the nascent nation, a direct, undeniable line traced straight back to that pivotal moment when men chose principle over profit and defiantly dumped a fortune's worth of tea into the cold waters of Boston Harbor. The Boston Tea Party, in its quiet audacity, showed the world that revolution doesn't always announce itself with the blare of trumpets and the waving of grand banners. Sometimes, it begins in the quiet, with a small, determined group of people standing in the cold, choosing courageous defiance over paralyzing fear. In dumping the tea, the colonists weren't just rejecting an unfair tax. They were rejecting an entire empire, a way of life, and a future dictated by others. And though the road ahead would be undeniably bloody, bitterly fought, and profoundly uncertain, one thing had become chillingly clear that night in Boston Harbor. The American colonies were no longer docile, loyal subjects. They were something entirely new, something dangerous, something utterly transformative. They were revolutionaries, and they were, indeed, just getting started. Long before the towering pyramids of Giza pierced the Egyptian sky, before Mesopotamian cities buzzed with the vibrant hum of ancient life, before the megalithic stones of Stonehenge were even wrestled into place, there existed Carol. Hidden away, tucked deeply within the parched, sun-baked valleys of coastal Peru, Carol rose in silent, breathtaking majesty nearly 5,000 years ago. This extraordinary civilization then, inexplicably, faded into near-complete oblivion, gradually swallowed by the relentless sands of time and utterly forgotten by history. For untold centuries, the modern world did not even remotely suspect its existence. The Sup Valley, the arid cradle where Carol once thrived, appears at first glance to be an utterly improbable location for a civilization to bloom and flourish. The landscape is relentlessly parched, stark, and seemingly barren. The Sup River itself little more than a thin, shimmering silver thread winding its precarious way through endless stretches of rock and dust. To most casual observers, it would appear profoundly inhospitable, a desolate place long abandoned by any signs of life. Yet, it was precisely here, amidst this stark desolation, that one of humanity's earliest and greatest cities miraculously took shape. Carroll was not merely a scattered collection of rudimentary huts or a temporary trading post. It was a meticulously planned metropolis, sprawling majestically over 150 acres, replete with monumental pyramids, expansive plazas, thoughtfully laid out residential quarters, and sacred ceremonial spaces. It possessed a breathtaking scale, a clear sense of purpose, and an astonishing vision. A complex society blossoming a full millennium before the Egyptians even began stacking stones into pyramids of their own. The remarkable people of Carroll achieved all of this without the aid of the wheel, without a written language as we understand it, and without metal tools. They constructed massive structures of stone and earth, not with advanced technology, but with sheer ingenuity, incredible communal effort, and the raw, unyielding power of human will. Yet, for thousands of years, Carroll's astonishing existence remained one of history's best-kept secrets. Even when occasional travelers stumbled across the strange, weathered mounds scattered across the valley floor, they invariably mistook them for natural geological formations, mere hills sculpted patiently by the relentless desert winds. No one, absolutely no one, imagined that beneath those unassuming sandy undulations lay one of the oldest cities in the entire world, predating even the celebrated civilizations that conventional history books had long crowned as the firsts. It wasn't until the late 20th century that a dedicated team of archaeologists, led by the indomitable Dr. Ruth Shady Solis, finally began to unearth the profound truth. What they found, buried deep within the silent dust of time, would not only rewrite the narrative of the Americas, but would force the entire world to fundamentally reconsider what it thought it knew about the very birth of civilization itself. Carroll had risen, flourished, and then fallen into total anonymity. Now, after millennia of profound silence, its ancient, sun-baked stones are speaking again, whispering intriguing tales of a peaceful, intelligent people who meticulously crafted a world of complexity, wonder, and profound spiritual depth in a land where life itself seemed, by all appearances, utterly impossible. And this, astonishingly, was only the beginning of their unfolding story. At first glance, the Sup Valley does indeed appear to be a place where life would struggle, constantly fighting for its very existence. Harsh, ceaseless winds sweep across seemingly endless stretches of sand and unforgiving stone. The merciless sun beats down relentlessly, baking the earth into vast, cracked, brittle sheets, mercilessly extracting every last drop of moisture. Water, the very elixir of life, is excruciatingly scarce, the Sup River merely a meandering, thin thread, itself battling fiercely for survival against the arid landscape. To the untrained, unseeing eye, it is nothing short of a wasteland, barren, empty, and seemingly forgotten by the gods themselves. But the astute people of Carroll possessed a different kind of vision. They did not perceive a desert to be feared or simply endured. Instead, they saw a vast, raw canvas waiting to be shaped, to be transformed by human ingenuity. They recognized the river, however modest its flow, as the undeniable lifeblood of possibility. And so, with an extraordinary blend of patience, brilliant ingenuity, and sheer, indomitable determination, they painstakingly transformed this utterly unforgiving place into a thriving oasis of life and sophisticated culture. Their first, and perhaps most crucial, victory was in the realm of agriculture. They meticulously learned to harness and tame the river's unpredictable seasonal floods, constructing remarkably simple yet brilliantly effective irrigation systems that skillfully channeled the precious water across the valley floor. Where others saw only endless sand and lifeless dust, they coaxed forth vibrant, green shoots of hope. Cotton, robust beans, nutritious squash, sweet guava, and starchy sweet potatoes all thrived under their diligent care. Cotton, in particular, blossomed into their most invaluable treasure. It was expertly spun into strong, durable fishing nets that supported thriving coastal communities, and woven into intricate textiles that served as both clothing and currency. This precious commodity fueled a sophisticated trade network with distant coastal villages, creating powerful economic and cultural bonds that stretched far beyond the confines of their desert homeland, weaving a tapestry of interdependence across the ancient Peruvian landscape. Beyond their agricultural prowess, the people of Carol demonstrated a profound, almost spiritual, understanding of their harsh environment. Their mastery wasn't about dominating the land, but about achieving a delicate equilibrium with it. They observed the desert's temperament, its cycles of extreme heat and sudden, torrential rains, and designed their entire built environment to harmonize with these forces. Homes and grand plazas, meticulously constructed from local stone and compacted earth, weren't merely shelters. They were climate-controlled marvels, engineered to offer cool sanctuary during the day's scorching embrace and to channel, rather than resist, the infrequent but violent downpours. Their wisdom extended to the heavens. Generations of observation had transformed the people of Carol into astute celestial cartographers, tracking the subtle dance of stars and the precise turning of the seasons. This sophisticated astronomical knowledge wasn't just for curiosity. It was integrated into their very survival, guiding their planting and harvesting with an accuracy that ensured sustained abundance in an otherwise unforgiving landscape. This interconnectedness wasn't limited to their immediate surroundings. Trade formed the vibrant circulatory system of Carol's economy, a complex web of exchange that stretched across vast distances. Imagine the bustling plazas, alive with the arrival and departure of goods, dried fish, essential for protein, the invaluable cotton, woven into intricate textiles and fishing nets, bountiful fruits from their irrigated lands, and a diverse array of handmade crafts. These commodities flowed from Carol along the intricate routes connecting up and down the Pacific coast, reaching communities hundreds of miles away. In return, Carol became a nexus for the exotic and the extraordinary. From the shimmering depths of the Pacific, they acquired iridescent shells, prized for their beauty and symbolic value. The majestic Andes yielded rare and vibrant stones, perhaps for adornment or ceremonial tools. And, crucially, this network facilitated an invaluable exchange of ideas. New techniques, beliefs, and artistic expressions filtered in from distant peoples, enriching Carol's own cultural tapestry. They were anything but isolated. They were a vital node in an ancient, thriving global network. In a land where the very notion of sustained habitation seemed a defiant gamble, Carol not only survived but flourished. Their triumph was not born of brute conquest or overwhelming force against the desert, but through an intelligent, innovative, and deeply communal partnership with it. They learned its subtle rhythms, respected its immense power, and built a society that transcended mere functionality, ascending to the truly extraordinary. Against the formidable odds of their arid homeland, Carol blossomed into an undeniable beacon of early civilization. And it was just beginning to etch its indelible mark upon history, manifesting in structures that still stand defiant today. Rising majestically from the desert floor like ancient, watchful guardians, the colossal pyramids of Carol inherently challenge and rewrite everything we once presumed to know about the genesis of civilization in the Americas. These weren't small, rudimentary mounds fashioned by a nascent society. On the contrary, the pyramids of Carol were awe-inspiring, deliberate works of monumental architecture, tangible proof of a people endowed with sophisticated vision, impeccable organization, and boundless ambition. The undeniable crown jewel of this ancient metropolis was the Pyramid Mayor, a towering testament to Carol's ingenuity. This colossal structure stretched an astounding 450 feet in length, its apex reaching nearly 60 feet above the desert floor, an engineering marvel on par with the most renowned early wonders of the ancient world, like the ziggurats of Mesopotamia or early dynastic Egyptian constructions. Constructed from a remarkable combination of cut stone, mud mortar, and ingeniously devised woven reed bags packed tight with rocks, The pyramids were built not merely to defy the relentless desert climate. They were specifically engineered to absorb and withstand the violent seismic tremors that frequently racked the Peruvian coast. And endure they did, standing resilient, silently witnessing the ebb and flow of nearly 5 millennia, a testament to their builders' profound understanding of their volatile environment. Crucially, Carroll's pyramids distinguished themselves sharply from the tomb complexes of ancient Egypt. They were not monuments to death or eternal resting places for rulers. Instead, they pulsated as vibrant centers of ceremony, power, and the beating heart of public life. Their terraced summits were crowned with temples and expansive gathering spaces, reached by broad, elegantly proportioned staircases that invited ascent. Here, under the boundless Peruvian sky, sacred fires once flickered against the twilight, their smoke carrying prayers upwards, while profound rituals unfolded, binding the community in shared spiritual experience. At the very base of these majestic structures, vast, circular sunken plazas fanned out, architectural masterpieces in themselves. Designed with meticulous precision, these amphitheater-like spaces could accommodate thousands, drawing them into a communal embrace for religious rites, vital political convocations, and exuberant communal celebrations. The entire cityscape of Carroll spoke volumes about its society, a people deeply valuing community, order, and an intricate connection to both their fellow citizens and the vast, mysterious cosmos. Radiating outwards from the central ceremonial core, smaller residential complexes provided homes for the city's diverse populace, likely priests who interpreted the celestial signs, administrators who orchestrated vast projects, skilled artisans who crafted the tools and treasures, and the farmers whose toil sustained them all. The strategic placement of the pyramids themselves was no accident. They were meticulously aligned with significant celestial events, marking sunrises, solstices, and the predictable cycles of the stars. For the people of Carroll, architecture transcended mere practicality. It was a profound synthesis of spirituality, advanced mathematics, and cosmic understanding. To walk among these weathered stones today is to experience an almost overwhelming sense of awe. These monumental structures were raised without the benefit of metal tools, without the revolutionary invention of the wheel, and without the raw power of beasts of burden. Yet, they emerged from the earth with breathtaking symmetry, grand scale, and staggering precision, a testament to human ingenuity and collective will. The Great Pyramids of Carroll, therefore, were not monuments to individual vanity or grim instruments of war. These monumental constructions were imbued with a far grander purpose. They were designed as sacred bridges, connecting the terrestrial realm to the celestial, fostering a profound bond between community and cosmos, between humanity and the eternal dance of time. And even today, as the desert winds sift through their ancient stones, they seem to whisper across the sands, recounting a story that resolutely refuses to be forgotten. Indeed, among the sun-baked ruins of Carroll, there is an overarching, profoundly different quality that unequivocally sets it apart from so many other ancient civilizations. The archaeological record here is remarkably quiet on one front. No weapons of war have been unearthed from beneath its ancient sands. There are no formidable defensive walls encircling its expansive plazas, no grim mass graves to hint at bloody conquests or the bitter scars of internal strife. In stark contrast to the myriad kingdoms that rose and fell through brutal warfare, Carroll emerged as a society uniquely built upon the bedrock of peace. This stands as nothing short of a revelation, a discovery that boldly defies conventional expectations about early human settlements. Here, nestled in the arid Super Valley, was a civilization that didn't just survive but flourished, not through the application of violence, but through the cultivation of cooperation, the establishment of far-reaching trade networks, and a powerful, unifying system of shared spiritual beliefs. The people of Carroll, it appears, chose to invest their collective energy and ingenuity not in forging armies or constructing impenetrable fortresses, but in the magnificent artistry of architecture, the meticulous science of astronomy, the evocative power of music, and the enriching fabric of communal life. Their grand plazas and soaring pyramids were not grim monuments commemorating victories over vanquished enemies. Instead, they were radiant centers of vibrant celebration, profound worship, and sophisticated civic governance. This was a civilization that consciously chose the path of gathering and unity over conquest, of negotiation and collaboration over destruction. Trade, therefore, was far more than an economic activity. It was the very lifeblood of Carroll's enduring success. The precious cotton, meticulously cultivated along the fertile riverbanks, was not just harvested. It was expertly spun into strong, durable fishing nets that became a highly sought-after commodity, exchanged with thriving coastal communities. In return, Carroll received a consistent supply of dried fish, an absolutely vital source of protein in their diet, alongside a dazzling array of exotic goods from distant lands. Imagine the vibrant exchanges: brilliant, iridescent shells from the sun-drenched Pacific beaches, rare and precious stones mined from the majestic highlands of the Andes, and even succulent tropical fruits carried from remote, verdant valleys. This expansive and intricate network of trade served as a powerful stitch, binding together disparate, far-flung communities into a peaceful and mutually beneficial web of interdependence. And at the very nexus of this intricate system, Carroll thrived as an undisputed cultural and economic hub. Religious and ceremonial life played an equally vital, unifying role, meticulously woven into the daily rhythm of the city to maintain social harmony and spiritual cohesion. The city's magnificent public spaces and the unique sunken plazas likely served as awe-inspiring stages for elaborate rituals that united the entire populace under a shared spiritual worldview, reinforcing their collective identity and purpose. Music, in particular, was not merely entertainment, but a profound communal experience that filled these gatherings. Flutes exquisitely carved from the hollow bones of condors, rhythmic drums fashioned from taut deer hides, created rich soundscapes that echoed across the vast desert, their melodies and rhythms resonating deep within, connecting individual lives to something immeasurably greater than themselves. Leadership within Carroll also presented a striking paradigm. It seemed to rely less on overt military might or coercive power and far more on spiritual authority, profound wisdom, and sophisticated civic organization. The city's leaders must have possessed extraordinary administrative acumen, coordinating massive, multi-generational construction projects, orchestrating the precise, seasonal agricultural cycles that ensured sustenance, and deftly navigating complex inter-regional trade agreements. All of this was achieved without leaving behind the brutal, indelible scars of war that so often characterized the rise of ancient empires. In a primordial world so frequently defined by incessant conflict and domination, Carroll stands as a shining, profound exception, a powerful reminder that civilization does not inherently have to ascend on the broken backs of the conquered. It can, instead, be painstakingly built by the quiet, enduring power of profound collaboration, boundless creativity, and deep, intrinsic trust among its people. Within Carroll, the very stones seemed to hum with the lingering echoes of a vibrant world long vanished. This was far more than a mere collection of buildings and a hub of trade. It was a city alive, pulsating with intricate sounds, deeply meaningful ceremonies, and an omnipresent spiritual rhythm. Music and ritual were not mere embellishments. They were inextricably woven into the very heartbeat and fabric of Carroll civilization. Archaeologists, meticulously sifting through the dry, protective sands, have uncovered a veritable treasure trove of ancient instruments. Flutes exquisitely crafted from the hollow bones of majestic condors and sea-bound pelicans, haunting whistles fashioned from polished deer antlers, and resonant drums stretched with the hides of animals. These weren't simple toys or rudimentary noisemakers. They were instruments of sophisticated design, crafted with immense care, often tuned to specific notes, and engineered to carry their melodic strains and rhythmic pulses across the expansive, open plazas of the city, reaching every ear within the gathered multitude. In a world predating written language, where complex ideas and emotions often lacked a tangible script, music served as the profound language of the soul, articulating the inexpressible. Imagine it, as dusk bled into twilight, the deep, resonant thrum of drums would begin its slow ascent, their primal beat grounding the senses. Flutes would then keen, their plaintive melodies weaving through the air like the desert wind itself, mournful yet full of longing. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, would gather in the sunken plazas, their feet stamping in rhythmic unison, illuminated by the fading light. Above them, on the pyramid platforms, sacred fires would crackle, their flames dancing against the deepening indigo sky. Priests, adorned in intricately woven garments reflecting the cosmos, would chant ancient prayers to the benevolent gods of the life-giving river, the fertile earth, and the guiding stars. In those hallowed moments, Carol was no longer just a city of stone and dust. It was a breathtaking symphony, a harmonious blend of human spirit and the vastness of the universe. The very architectural layout of Carol strongly suggests that ritual life lay at its absolute core. The grand plazas, far from being simple open spaces, were meticulously designed stages for communal ceremonies, purposefully shaped to draw people together, fostering a sense of shared experience and unity. The iconic sunken circular courts, with their precise geometry, function much like ancient amphitheaters, acoustically focusing both sound and sight onto the sacred rituals performed at their very centers. And towering above them all, the pyramids loomed, not as grim tombs, but as sacred, man-made mountains, symbolic conduits linking the earthly realm to the celestial heavens. Rituals would have likely marked the pivotal turning of the seasons, the crucial cycles of planting and harvest, and the predictable movements of the stars, underscoring humanity's deep connection to the natural and cosmic order. Music, in this context, transcended mere entertainment. It served as a powerful, ethereal bridge between people, between humanity and the divine, between the tangible known and the ineffable mysteries beyond. Notably, no violent murals depicting gruesome battles, no terrifying gods of war demanding bloodthirsty sacrifices have ever been found. In Carol, the spiritual world appears to have been one of harmony, joyous celebration, and profound reverence for life. Even today, when the desert wind whispers through the ancient ruins, you can almost hear it, the faint, haunting strains of ancient music, the forgotten songs of a people who discovered immense beauty, profound meaning, and deep spiritual connection in the heart of the harsh, endless sands. Carol, however, was not only a place of exquisite music, bustling trade, and profound ritual. It was a veritable marvel of ancient engineering, a testament to unparalleled human ingenuity flourishing in one of the most unforgiving landscapes on Earth. Without the aid of metal tools, without the revolutionary invention of the wheel, and devoid of the brute strength of draft animals, the resourceful people of Carol sculpted a city of enduring stone and earth that has remarkably persevered for nearly 5,000 years. Their achievements were nothing short of astonishing. Massive pyramids, not constructed from small, fragile bricks, but from enormous, carefully selected stones, rose majestically from the desert floor. These colossal stones were transported across the dry valley not by carts or beasts, but by human labor, using ingenious, durable reed bags, strong, woven baskets crafted from the very resilient plants that thrived along the river banks. Layer upon painstaking layer, they built with an almost sacred care, stacking stone and meticulously filling the interiors with rubble to create structures engineered not only to withstand the relentless erosion of time, but also the furious, unpredictable forces of nature. And their understanding of nature was not theoretical, it was intimately practical. Carol lies in a region notoriously prone to violent earthquakes, yet its pyramids and plazas have survived, largely intact, for millennia. How? by mastering the art of earthquake-resistant architecture, a groundbreaking feat for their era. Their builders employed flexible construction techniques, utilizing layered fills, exceptionally wide foundations, and gracefully rounded corners, design elements that allowed their monumental structures to absorb and subtly dissipate seismic energy, preventing catastrophic collapse. This was engineering born not from academic textbooks, but from an intimate, lived knowledge of the earth itself, its tremors, and its power. Water management represented another silent, yet monumental, triumph. Despite inhabiting an arid desert, the people of Carroll developed exquisitely sophisticated irrigation systems. A network of meticulously designed channels and canals carefully guided the life-giving river water to their extensive agricultural fields, enabling crops to flourish even during prolonged dry seasons. Their philosophy was clear: no water was ever wasted, every precious drop mattered. The very layout of Carroll itself reflected brilliant urban planning and a deep connection to the cosmos. Major structures were not haphazardly placed. They were precisely aligned with key astronomical points, suggesting an advanced understanding of the solar and lunar cycles. The sunken plazas, with their remarkable geometric precision, were more than mere gathering places. They functioned as sophisticated instruments for tracking the heavens, allowing priests and astronomers to predict seasons with accuracy crucial for agricultural success and survival. Even the city's broader organization spoke of a complex, well-ordered society. Residential zones, administrative areas, and sacred ceremonial centers were all harmoniously arranged, striking a delicate balance between the practicalities of communal life and the spiritual significance of their sacred spaces. They built not just for the fleeting moment, but with a profound vision for generations to come. Today, as modern engineers study and marvel at Carroll's incredible resilience, they are profoundly reminded that true greatness is not solely measured by technological advancement. Sometimes, the deepest and most enduring wisdom lies in understanding the fundamental forces of nature, in working with the land, rather than aggressively against it. Carroll's stones have stoically endured fierce storms, devastating quakes, and the relentless erosion of time itself. They stand as a silent, powerful testament to a civilization that ingeniously engineered their grandest dreams into the very desert sands. For centuries, the city of Carroll flourished with unparalleled serenity, a radiant beacon of peace, the rhythmic heart of music and ritual, a bustling nexus of trade, and a testament to architectural mastery embedded within the unforgiving desert sands. And then, subtly, almost imperceptibly, without the drama of cataclysm, it was abandoned. No telltale scorch marks of devastating fires signify its fall. No brutal scars of conquest mar its walls. No defensive fortifications hint at a final, desperate stand. No mass graves or shattered monuments recount a narrative of sudden disaster or violent overthrow. Instead, Carroll simply receded, a slow, quiet fading. Its once vibrant plazas gradually emptied, the echoes of ceremony and laughter dying out. Its majestic pyramids were left to the relentless embrace of the drifting sands, their flutes and drums silenced by the slow, inexorable march of time. Why did they leave? That profound question still lingers, an ethereal presence, a ghost whispering across the super valley. Some scholars postulate that a devastating shift in environmental conditions delivered the final, crippling blow. Compelling evidence suggests that a prolonged and severe period of drought may have inexorably crippled Carroll's carefully managed agriculture. Without the life-giving waters of the Soup River, their meticulously tended fields would have withered, and the intricate trade networks, so dependent on a surplus of cotton, fish, and food, would have inevitably faltered. The delicate, hard-won balance Carroll had so ingeniously maintained with its harsh environment may have, at last, tipped beyond any hope of repair. Other compelling theories point to a gradual reorientation of ancient trade routes. As neighboring cultures along the coast and inland grew in prominence, developing their own centers of power and production, Carol's singular influence might have gradually diminished. Perhaps the essential goods they once supplied, their prized cotton, their abundant dried fish, their diverse agricultural produce, were no longer sufficient to sustain their preeminent role as a dominant regional city. Slowly, like water seeping from a cracked vessel, the very lifeblood of commerce drained away. Still others whisper of internal decline, a gradual fraying from within. In the absence of written records, we are left to imagine the intricate dance of political struggles, the slow erosion of religious beliefs, or perhaps simply the accumulated exhaustion after centuries of sustained growth and complex societal maintenance. Even the most peaceful and harmonious societies can eventually fracture under immense pressure, particularly when the fundamental certainty of survival becomes increasingly precarious. Whatever the ultimate catalyst, the departure of Carol's inhabitants appears to have been a gradual, migratory process rather than a sudden exodus. Families likely drifted away, one by one, their gaze fixed on more fertile valleys, the promise of stronger, more reliable rivers, and the hope of new beginnings elsewhere. Children who once chased each other across Carol's hallowed plazas would grow up recounting stories of a magnificent, lost city left behind, tales that, over generations, would eventually fade into the realm of legend. The desert, with its slow, persistent hand, reclaimed what human ingenuity had so painstakingly built. Winds, laden with fine sand, swept over the stone temples, softening their edges. The flutes and drums, once resonant with life, lay buried beneath shifting dunes. What had once been a humming, vibrant civilization became a field of silent, sleeping mounds, waiting patiently for nearly 4,000 years. Today, as dedicated archaeologists meticulously peel back the layers of sand, carefully uncovering its ancient stones, the central question continues to burn with an insistent urgency. How could a city so advanced, so beautifully crafted, so remarkably enduring, simply vanish without a trace? Perhaps the profound truth lies in the understanding that even the greatest civilizations, regardless of their wisdom, their peace, or their architectural might, are ultimately fragile, intricate threads woven into the vast, ever-unfolding tapestry of time, forever vulnerable to the unseen, relentless forces of change. For millennia, Carol remained profoundly forgotten, buried deep beneath the silent, protective sands of the Soup Valley. Travelers, traversing the ancient landscape, often passed by strange, rounded hills that dotted the terrain, never once suspecting that beneath their very feet lay the sprawling ruins of a civilization that predated even the pyramids of Egypt. To them, these were simply natural formations, geological anomalies sculpted by the relentless hands of wind and time. It wasn't until the twilight of the 20th century that the world would finally begin to hear Carol's voice again. In the 1990s, the pioneering Peruvian archaeologist Ruth Shady led a dedicated team into the Soup Valley, driven by an insatiable curiosity and a growing, intuitive sense that these unassuming hills might conceal secrets no one had yet dared to uncover. What they unearthed would not merely add a chapter to history. It would fundamentally rewrite the entire narrative of human civilization in the Americas. Layer by painstaking layer, the ancient sand was brushed away, revealing astonishing truths. Beneath the desert's shroud emerged walls of meticulously cut stone, grand, processional staircases, expansive sunken plazas, and, of course, the monumental pyramids. Collectively, a city far older, far more complex than anyone had ever dared to imagine for this region. Radiocarbon dating unequivocally confirmed the almost unbelievable. Carol was over 4,600 years old, a thriving metropolis coincident with the very earliest civilizations blooming in Mesopotamia and Egypt. It was a discovery that sent reverberations through the very foundations of archaeology, shaking established paradigms to their core. Before Carol, scholars largely believed that sophisticated civilization in the Americas developed much later, often viewed as being shadowed by the great empires of the Old World. Carol utterly changed everything. It provided irrefutable proof that the Americas had independently birthed monumental architecture, complex urban life, and advanced social organization millennia before the rise of the Incas or the Maya, proving an independent, parallel trajectory of human development. Ruth Shady and her indefatigable team found not just inert stone and rubble, but the tangible remnants of life itself. Intricately crafted musical instruments, durable fishing nets, vibrant textiles, quipus, ancient knot records hinting at a sophisticated system of information storage, and even delicate offerings made to the gods. Each painstakingly recovered artifact told a resonant story of a people who had built a society brimming with vision, intelligence, and profound, enduring creativity. Carroll's rediscovery was far more than a mere academic triumph. It was, in essence, a resurrection. A magnificent civilization that had slumbered beneath the desert's embrace for thousands of years now stood revealed under the open sky once more, its ancient plazas kissed by the very same winds that had once carried the haunting sounds of flutes and the joyous laughter of children. Today, Carroll is rightfully recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, a fragile, priceless link to humanity's earliest, universal dreams of building, of belonging, and of believing. The sands had indeed hidden Carroll well, a protective shroud. But in the grand calculus of time, the stones endured, waiting patiently for someone to listen, to truly see, and to finally remember. Carroll stands today as a silent, majestic giant, an enduring reminder that civilization's roots stretch far deeper and are far more diverse than we once believed possible. Among its weathered pyramids and expansive plazas, the ancient stones whisper a profound story that fundamentally reshapes our understanding of humanity's long, intricate journey, a narrative not dominated by conquest and bloodshed, but by harmony, unparalleled ingenuity, and enduring hope. Long before the towering empires of Greece, Rome, or even the unified dynasties of Egypt, the ingenious people of Carroll were meticulously building something truly extraordinary. They raised colossal pyramids without the aid of the wheel. They meticulously mapped the intricate dance of the stars without the benefit of written records. They forged a thriving, complex society deeply rooted in peaceful trade, evocative music, unifying ritual, and astonishing engineering, all achieved without leaving behind the brutal, indelible scars of war upon the land. In an era of antiquity so often tragically defined by incessant conflict and ruthless domination, Carroll offers a radically different, inspiring vision of what civilization can be. It presents a society that inherently valued deep connection and communal well-being over conquest, profound knowledge over brute domination. It powerfully reminds us that societal complexity does not inherently require violence, and that true greatness is not measured by the number of armies that march across a battlefield, but by how a community unites to build, to create, to dream, and to thrive together. Carroll's enduring legacy reaches far beyond the dry sands of the Soup Valley. It fundamentally challenges antiquated assumptions that civilization had a single, exclusive cradle, or that urban life and monumental architecture belonged exclusively, first and foremost, to the Old World. Carroll stands as irrefutable proof that humanity's indomitable spirit of innovation and boundless aspiration arose independently in many diverse corners of the earth, shaped by different hands and cultural nuances, yet driven by the same eternal, universal desires to endure, to celebrate, and to reach toward the divine. Today, walking among Carroll's weathered, ancient ruins, you can almost perceive it, the faint, rhythmic pulse of drums, the low, haunting hum of flutes, the murmur of traders bargaining amicably in the bustling plazas, the joyful laughter of children racing through narrow stone alleys beneath a sky of endless, star-studded wonder. Their lives, their dreams, their profound stories are still with us, etched indelibly into the very bones of the earth. Carroll teaches us that even when great civilizations eventually decline and fall, their spirit, their ethos, can endure. sleeping patiently under layers of sand, waiting to be remembered, waiting to inspire again. In the grand, sweeping timeline of human history, Carol shines not merely as a relic of a distant past, but as a powerful beacon for the future, a profound reminder that even in the harshest deserts, even under the heaviest, most concealing sands, the potent seeds of wonder, wisdom, and peace can take deep root and blossom, helping humanity build a world that forever reaches for the stars.